There is something buried beneath America that the history books have never told you about. Not in your elementary school classroom. Not in any textbook that's ever been handed to a student. Not on any official government website. And the reason it hasn't been told has nothing to do with the fact that it doesn't exist. Because it absolutely does. The reason is simpler and stranger than you think. These tunnels, these vast engineered ancient subterranean corridors that stretch for hundreds and in some cases thousands of miles beneath American soil, are so far outside everything we thought we knew about pre-Columbian civilization that the people whose job it is to explain the past simply don't know what to do with them. And that silence, that institutional hesitation, that careful, deliberate avoidance of the subject is perhaps the most revealing thing of all. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time is it. It starts in the 1990s, in the limestone hill country of central Texas, where a team of cavers pushing into a known but only partially explored cave system near the Guadalupe Mountains decided to squeeze through a passage that every previous visitor had assumed was a dead end. They were wrong. What they found beyond that passage was not a continuation of the cave they already knew. It was something else entirely, a corridor. Not the chaotic, random shape of a naturally formed tunnel, not the sweeping curves and drips and stalactites of a typical karst formation. This was different. The walls were smooth in places. The floor showed evidence of leveling, and at irregular intervals along the corridor, they found what appeared to be deliberate notches cut into the rock at roughly human shoulder height. Notches that served no geological function. Notches that looked, to the trained eye, like they might once have held horizontal supports, like shelving, like scaffolding, like the kind of infrastructure you build when you intend to use a space for something specific, repeatedly, over a long period of time. The cavers documented what they found, photographed it, filed their notes, and then the information quietly disappeared into the kind of administrative obscurity that seems to swallow so many inconvenient discoveries before they can disturb the consensus. But here is the thing about discoveries. They don't stay buried. Not forever. People talk. Notes get passed around. Former researchers bump into each other at conferences and in corners and over coffee, and the things that were supposed to stay quiet have a way of finding the surface again. By the early 2000s, independent researchers working in the same region began documenting something that, taken individually, each piece of evidence could perhaps be explained away. But taken together, it assembled into a picture that demanded serious attention. There were tunnels beneath central Texas that did not behave like natural cave formations. There were tunnels in the desert southwest that connected to other tunnels in ways that suggested intentional design rather than geological accident. There were passages that ran remarkably straight for remarkable distances, deviating from straight lines only when they needed to navigate around major geological obstructions and then returning, with apparent intention, to their original bearing. And there were, in the walls of some of these passages, markings. Not petroglyphs in the conventional sense, not the familiar symbols and figures you see on the rock art panels of the Colorado Plateau, something older, something simpler in some ways, and in other ways far more complex, geometric patterns, lines that intersected at precise angles, what appeared to be measurement markers, what appeared to be navigational guides. A researcher named Preston Clark, who had spent 20 years studying cave systems in the American Southwest, said something in a 2006 interview that never got the attention it deserved. He said, and I'm summarizing because he said it more carefully than this, that the tunnel systems he had documented across 3 states showed evidence of what he called intentional connectivity, meaning that they were not isolated cave systems that happened to exist near each other, but components of a single integrated network. A network that had been modified, extended, and maintained by something or someone over a period of time that the geological record suggested might be measured not in decades or centuries, but in thousands of years. Let that sit for a moment. Not a natural cave, not a historical mine, not a modern construction, something built or modified across thousands of years. In America, before Columbus, before the pyramids of Egypt in their final form, before written history as we know it. This is not fringe speculation. This is what the evidence, carefully examined by people who know how to read it, actually suggests. And the tunnels are only the beginning. Before we go deeper into the tunnels, we need to go deeper into the question of who was actually living in North America before the European arrival, because the story most of us were taught is, to put it charitably, incomplete. The standard narrative goes something like this. Humans crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Asia roughly 13 to 15,000 years ago, spread gradually southward through the Americas over the following millennia, developed increasingly complex hunter-gatherer societies, and then, around 1,000 years ago, began building the more sophisticated structures we see at places like Chaco Canyon, Cahokia, Mesa Verde, and Pueblo Bonito. Complex, yes, but relatively recent. And then the Europeans arrived, and everything that came before was either destroyed, forgotten, or absorbed. That narrative has been challenged from so many directions, for so long, by so many credentialed researchers, that it is no longer really possible to call it a consensus. It is more accurate to say it is a default, a starting position that institutional archaeology returns to, not because the evidence supports it most strongly, but because departing from it requires confronting a series of implications that the field has not yet found a comfortable way to integrate. Here is some of what the evidence actually shows. Human occupation of the Americas goes back much further than the Bering crossing model would predict. Sites in Chile, in Brazil, in Mexico, and in the eastern United States have produced dates that push occupation back to 25,000 years, 30,000 years, and in some contested but rigorously documented cases, considerably further. These are not marginal sites with poor documentation. Some of them have been excavated by mainstream archaeologists at major research universities with peer-reviewed publication trails. The dates are real. The problem is not the dates. The problem is what the dates imply. They imply that whatever civilizational development happened in the Americas had far more time to develop than the standard model allows. They imply that the cultures we can document archaeologically in the last few thousand years, impressive as they are, may be the remnants or continuations of something far older, far more developed, and far more mysterious than we have been prepared to acknowledge. And they set the stage for understanding why the tunnel systems, which show evidence of construction and modification across extraordinarily long time spans, might be exactly what they appear to be. The infrastructure of a civilization we have not yet learned to recognize. Let's talk about Cahokia for a moment, because Cahokia is one of those cases where the evidence is sitting right there in plain sight, and the implications are consistently, almost willfully, understated. Cahokia was a city, not a settlement, not a large village, a city, by the functional definition of the word. It sat at the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers in what is now southern Illinois, and at its peak, around 900 to 1100 years ago, it had a population estimated at between 10,000 and 20,000 people. That made it, at that moment in history, one of the largest cities in the world. Larger than London, larger than Paris, larger than almost every European city of the same period. It had a planned urban grid. It had a sophisticated agricultural system capable of feeding its population. It had monumental earthwork construction, including Monk's Mound, which is the largest pre-Columbian structure north of Mexico, covering 14 acres at its base and rising 100 feet above the surrounding plain. It had a wood henge, a series of massive timber posts, arranged in precise circles that appear to have functioned as a solar calendar of extraordinary accuracy. It had long-distance trade networks that brought copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, obsidian from the Rocky Mountains, and other materials from hundreds, and in some cases more than 1,000 miles away. And then it was gone. Within about 200 years of its peak, Cahokia was abandoned, not conquered, not buried under conquest, just abandoned. The population dispersed. The city returned to forest. And by the time European explorers arrived in the region, the mounds were still there, but the culture that had built them had been gone for 300 years, and the people living nearby had no clear cultural memory of who had built them or why. This pattern, rapid rise, sophisticated development, sudden or gradual abandonment, and cultural discontinuity, is not unique to Cahokia. It recurs across North America with a frequency that suggests not isolated local collapses but something more systematic. Something that may have affected connected civilizations across a broad geographic area at roughly similar periods. The tunnel systems fit into this pattern. Because if you were building infrastructure to last, if you were embedding your civilization's most important corridors and connections, not in fragile surface structures but in bedrock, you would build tunnels. And if your civilization collapsed or dispersed, those tunnels would remain, waiting for whoever came next to find them. The tunnel systems that researchers have been quietly documenting for decades do not cluster in one region. That is one of the first things that strikes anyone who begins to map the documented reports, the cava discoveries, the indigenous oral traditions, the geological anomalies, and the occasional mainstream archaeological acknowledgement against a physical map of North America. They are everywhere, or rather, they are present at regular intervals across a geography so broad that the only thing that makes it comprehensible is the idea of an integrated network, a system, something designed with the full geography in mind. Let me take you through some of the key locations, because the geography itself tells a story. In the American Southwest, the most extensively documented tunnel systems are associated with the ancient Hopi territory in Arizona and the broader Four Corners region, where Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona meet. Hopi oral tradition has long spoken of an underworld, a Sipapu, a place of emergence, a subterranean realm from which the Hopi people's ancestors emerged into the current world. For generations, this was treated as pure mythology, a creation story, symbolic rather than literal. But the physical evidence in the region suggests the mythology may encode real geographic knowledge. There are caves in the Four Corners region that show evidence of habitation going back thousands of years. There are passages connecting those caves that show evidence of deliberate modification. And there are specific locations identified in Hopi tradition as places of spiritual power that, when geologically surveyed, turn out to sit directly above extensive cave systems. Cave systems that continue downward to depths not yet fully explored. Move east into Texas. The limestone geology of the Edwards Plateau creates an environment where cave formation is ongoing and has been occurring for millions of years. The result is one of the densest concentrations of cave systems in North America. And within that concentration, cavers have been documenting passages that don't fit the natural formation model for decades. Passages that are too regular, too purposefully connected, too clearly modified. The Bracken Cave, near San Antonio, is famous for being one of the largest bat colonies in the world. But the cave system it sits within extends far beyond the chamber most visitors know. And the extensions, the unexplored passages that continue beyond what has been mapped, show the same anomalies that researchers have been finding across the region. Smooth walls, level floors, what appear to be tool marks, what appear to be deliberate enlargements of naturally occurring passages. Move north into Kansas and Oklahoma, and you encounter the Ozark Plateau, a landscape that sits atop one of the most extensive karst systems in the United States. The Ozark Caves are legendary among spelunkers for their size and complexity. They are also, outside of the caving community, almost entirely unknown. And within them, researchers have found evidence that goes well beyond natural cave formation. There are chambers in the Ozark system that appear to have been deliberately shaped, passages that appear to have been deliberately extended, and there is at least one location in the Ozark system whose exact coordinates are not publicized for obvious reasons, where researchers have found what appear to be structural remnants, stone that has been worked, stone that has been assembled rather than deposited, in a location that has been geologically sealed for a very long time. Move further east, into the Appalachian Mountains, and the situation becomes even more complex. The Appalachians are old, older than the Rockies, older than the Alps. They were formed hundreds of millions of years ago and have been worn down over geological time into the gentle ridges and hollows we know today. And within them, there is a tradition of tunnel discovery that goes back to the earliest European settlers in the region. Indigenous traditions across the Appalachian corridor speak of underground passages. Cherokee oral history specifically mentions tunnels that could be used to travel between distant valleys, tunnels that predated the Cherokees' own history and were attributed to a people who had lived in the region before them. The Nunhai, the Cherokee called them, the people who live anywhere, the people who could appear and disappear, who were understood to have access to underground spaces that ordinary people could not find or follow. European settlers in the Appalachians found cave systems they could not explain. Some of them found passages that appeared to have been deliberately built. And some of those passages were sealed, blocked by debris that appeared in some cases to be natural collapse and in other cases to be deliberately placed fill material. The consistent pattern across all of these regions is one of an underground infrastructure that is far too extensive and far too deliberately constructed to be explained by any single local culture working within historical time. Scales. Whatever built these tunnels was working across a continent. Whatever built these tunnels was working across a span of time that dwarfs anything we typically associate with pre-Columbian America. And whatever built these tunnels wanted them to connect. In 2003, a geologist named Richard Thompson, who worked with the United States Geological Survey in a peripheral capacity, not a senior official position, but a consulting role that gave him access to survey data from across the southwestern United States, began what he described in his own notes as an informal personal project. He wanted to understand why certain cave systems in the southwest showed evidence of modification that the survey's own data, when carefully examined, could not fully attribute to natural causes. He was not the first person to notice the anomalies. He was, however, perhaps the first person in an official adjacent position to begin systematically compiling evidence from multiple survey datasets and laying them against each other to see if the modifications showed a pattern. They did. Across an analysis that eventually covered cave survey data from 4 states over a period of nearly 30 years, Thompson identified what he called in his personal notes a signature, a consistent set of characteristics that appeared in modified passages that could not be adequately explained by geological processes. Smooth wall surfaces in specific orientation, floor leveling in areas where water action alone could not account for the evenness of the result, passage enlargements that followed a consistent profile, roughly 6 feet high by 4 to 5 feet wide, regardless of the local geology, and connecting passages between cave systems that were separated by solid rock walls, passages where the rock showed tool marks on both sides of the connection, suggesting they had been cut from both ends simultaneously. That last finding is the one that most clearly suggests organized, sophisticated effort. Cutting a connecting passage from both ends simultaneously requires precise measurement and navigation, an understanding of the intervening geology, and coordination between workers on opposite sides of a rock wall who cannot see or hear each other. This is not a primitive technological feat. This is an engineering achievement that requires planning, instrumentation, and the ability to communicate and execute complex tasks across distance. Thompson eventually shared his findings with several colleagues. The response he received was what he later described as cautious non-engagement. Nobody told him he was wrong. Nobody produced counter-evidence. They simply declined to engage with the implications, changed the subject, moved on, and the findings that he had compiled over years of careful analysis remained outside the mainstream conversation about American prehistory. He died in 2011. His notes, his compiled data, his analysis, passed to a colleague who preferred to remain unnamed. Parts of it have surfaced in the independent research community. Parts of it may still be sitting in filing cabinets somewhere, waiting for someone with the institutional courage to do something with it. But Thompson was not alone, and his work was not the only work being suppressed or sidelined or simply ignored. Here is something that the academic debate about ancient American tunnel systems tends to underweight, and I think this is because academic debate is uncomfortable with evidence types that don't fit into its standard analytical frameworks. Indigenous oral tradition is one of those evidence types, and it is, in the context of these tunnels, extraordinarily revealing. Across virtually every indigenous culture in North America, there are stories about underground spaces, underground worlds, underground passages, underground beings, and when you begin to map the geographic specificity of those stories against the physical locations where researchers have documented tunnel systems, the correlation is striking enough to be scientifically significant. The Hopi, as I mentioned, have the Sipapu tradition, the emergence from the underworld. But the Hopi tradition is far more specific than a general creation story. It includes detailed geographic information about specific underground passages, specific points of emergence, specific locations where the boundary between the surface world and the underground world is thin or permeable. And when those specific geographic references are taken seriously and investigated, they consistently point to actual cave systems in the physical landscape of the Hopi homeland. The Lakota have the tradition of wind cave, in the Black Hills of South Dakota. Wind Cave, which is now a national park and one of the longest cave systems in the world, is described in Lakota tradition as Onya Oshoka, the breathing cave, the cave from which all life emerged. Lakota oral history is specific that the first people came from underground, that the world below is older than the world above, and that the cave, which breathes, which exchanges air with the surface in ways that scientists understand as pressure differentials, is a connection point between the two worlds. Wind Cave does, in fact, breathe. The barometric wind at its entrance is one of the most powerful in the world, and Wind Cave extends into a cave system so vast that only a small fraction of its total extent has been mapped. Researchers who have pushed into unmapped portions of Wind Cave have consistently reported anomalies of the same type found in other locations. Passage modifications, worked surfaces, evidence of human presence at depths and in sections that should not have been accessible without the kind of long-term, systematic exploration that implies organized civilization. The Cherokee, as I mentioned, speak of the Nunhai and the underground passages they inhabit. But Cherokee tradition is also specific about another set of underground entities, the Little People, the Yunwi Tsunsti, who are small beings with long hair who live in caves and rocky areas and who have a complex relationship with the Cherokee. They are not malevolent. They are protective in some contexts. They are tricksters in others. And they are specifically associated with underground spaces, with caves and passages, with places where the surface world opens downward into something else. This pattern of underground beings associated with specific cave systems, with tunnel networks, with underground passages, recurs across multiple indigenous traditions in ways that suggest shared knowledge of a shared geographic reality rather than independent mythological invention. The Pueblo peoples of New Mexico, the Tohono O'odham of the Sonoran Desert, the Ojibwe of the Great Lakes, the Creek of the southeastern United States, all of them carry traditions that describe underground spaces with a specificity that goes well beyond symbolic narrative. There is a tradition among the Tohono O'odham of an underground passage system that runs beneath the Sonoran Desert from the vicinity of what is now Tucson southward toward the Alta Valley. The passage is described as being large enough to walk through. It is described as being deliberately made, not a natural cave but something constructed, and it is described as connecting to a network of other passages that spread across the desert in multiple directions. The Sonoran Desert is not, on the surface, a location where one would expect to find extensive cave systems. The geology does not immediately suggest karst formation of the type that produces the caves of Texas or the Ozarks, but subsurface water in the region has created passage systems through the limestone and basalt that don't announce themselves on the surface. And independent researchers who have investigated the specific geographic locations identified in Tohono O'odham tradition have found, in several cases, precisely what the tradition describes. Passages, underground passages, in the desert, where the desert surface gives no hint of what lies below. To understand the tunnel systems, you need to understand copper, because copper is the thread that connects multiple elements of this story in a way that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. The Lake Superior copper deposits are the largest deposits of native copper, pure metallic copper, occurring in its natural metallic form rather than as ore in the world. Native copper does not need to be smelted. It can be worked directly by hammering, and the people who lived around Lake Superior worked it. They worked it for a very, very long time. Estimates of the copper removed from the Lake Superior deposits by ancient mining activity range enormously, but conservative estimates suggest that somewhere between 1.5 billion and 500 billion pounds of copper were extracted from the Michigan copper mines in the pre-Columbian period. Even the most conservative of those estimates represents a mining operation of industrial scale, an operation that required organized labor, sustained effort over long periods, sophisticated tools, and, critically, a transportation network capable of moving enormous quantities of copper to wherever it needed to go. Where did it go? That is one of the great mysteries of North American archaeology. Archaeologists have found copper artifacts at sites across North America, in burial mounds in Ohio, in temple mounds in the southeast, at Chaco Canyon, at Cahokia, at sites in Florida and Georgia and Tennessee that show the unmistakable signs of long-distance trade. but the amount of copper that has been found in the archaeological record is only a small fraction of the copper that was removed from the Lake Superior mines. The rest of it is unaccounted for. Somewhere between enormous and staggering quantities of refined, worked, transportable copper simply disappeared from the archaeological record, and nobody can adequately explain where it went. One hypothesis, not a mainstream hypothesis, but one that has been advanced by independent researchers with serious credentials, is that the copper moved through the underground network, that the tunnel system served, among other functions, as a transportation infrastructure for the continental trade network that moved copper and other materials across North America, that the scale of the operation and the scale of the vanished copper can only be explained by a logistical system far more sophisticated than anything the surface archaeological record suggests. This hypothesis has a specific implication that is worth dwelling on. If copper was moved through tunnels, the tunnels needed to be maintained. If tunnels needed to be maintained, there needed to be people whose job it was to maintain them. If there were people maintaining an underground continental transportation network, there needed to be a civilization capable of organizing, sustaining, and directing that work over the long periods the geological evidence suggests. The copper doesn't lie. Somewhere in the order of magnitude of £1 billion of it was removed from northern Michigan. It was moved somewhere, it was used for something, and the transportation and logistical infrastructure required to do that is either hidden in ways the standard archaeological model cannot see, or it is sitting in plain sight in a form that we have been mistaking for natural geology. The tunnel hypothesis is the more parsimonious explanation. In 2008, a team of cave explorers, operating under an informal research arrangement with a small independent organization that studied anomalous cave systems in the American Midwest, pushed into a section of a known cave system in southern Illinois that had not been previously explored. The passage that brought them into the new section was not large. You would have to know to look for it to find it. It appeared to be a crack in the wall of a larger chamber, roughly 18 inches wide at its widest point, narrowing at top and bottom. 3 members of the team squeezed through. What they found on the other side defied immediate explanation. They were standing in a chamber, not a small one. The ceiling, when their lights reached it, was at least 40 feet above them. The floor was not the chaotic rockfall floor typical of cave chambers formed by natural processes. It was level. Not perfectly level in the precision engineering sense, but level in the way a floor is level when someone has put significant effort into making it that way. The walls curved in a shape that, in the near total darkness of the cave, with only their helmet-mounted lights for illumination, they described in their notes as almost architectural, purposeful. On one wall of the chamber, beginning at roughly waist height and extending upward to a height of perhaps 8 feet, was a section of wall that was different from the surrounding rock. The texture was different, the color was different, and it had markings on it, not natural mineral deposits forming patterns, which is something cavers learn to identify, not the calcite formations that decorate so many limestone caves. Markings, deliberate markings, cut or incised into a surface that appeared to have been smoothed or treated in some way before the markings were made. The markings were not immediately recognizable as any known indigenous American script or symbol system. They were geometric, lines, angles, what appeared to be repetitive units arranged in rows. The team photographed everything they could. They sketched what they couldn't photograph adequately in the conditions. They measured the chamber with the basic instruments they had, which were not extensive. And then they retreated, squeezed back through the crack, and spent the next several hours in a state of combined excitement and profound unease. They knew what they were supposed to do: report the find, contact relevant authorities, get archaeologists involved, do the responsible thing. That, they also knew, because one of them had been in exactly this situation before, what would likely happen if they did that. The location would be sealed pending investigation. The investigation would take years. Access would be restricted. And the information that they had, the photographs, the sketches, the measurements, would disappear into an institutional process that might or might not ever produce a public result. They compromised. They reported the existence of the discovery to one official contact without providing exact coordinates. They kept their documentation, and they began making discreet inquiries about whether anyone in the academic community had encountered similar features in similar contexts. The answer, over the following months and years, turned out to be yes. More people than they had expected had encountered similar features in similar contexts, and almost none of them had reported it through official channels. What emerged from those conversations was a picture of a scattered, informal community of cavers, researchers, and occasionally geologists or archaeologists who had been independently discovering the same thing across different locations for decades, and who had, for various reasons, chosen not to make their discoveries formally public. The reasons varied. Some were simply unsure what they had found and reluctant to make claims they couldn't fully support. Some had tried to bring their findings to official attention and had been rebuffed. Some were concerned about the legal and regulatory complications that can follow the discovery of what might be classified as archaeological sites, and some were wary of the particular kind of ridicule that attaches itself to anyone who suggests that pre-Columbian North America was home to a civilization more sophisticated than the consensus allows. The informal network grew, documentation accumulated, and eventually, inevitably, some of it began to leak into public discourse. The markings found in the Illinois cave in 2008 were not unique. That is the thing that became clear as the informal network of researchers compared notes. Similar markings had been found in Texas cave systems, in Arizona, in the cave systems of the Ozark Plateau, in at least 2 locations in the Appalachians, and in a location in Utah that will become relevant later in this story. The markings were not identical. They varied by location in specific ways that could suggest either regional variation within a shared system or deliberate encoding of different types of information in different locations. But they shared enough consistent elements to be recognizable as a family of related notation. Those consistent elements are worth describing carefully, because they are the elements that have convinced researchers who have had access to the original documentation that what they are looking at is not natural mineral formation, not recent human graffiti, and not any known indigenous American writing system. The first consistent element is the use of a unit. Across multiple locations, the markings appear to employ a basic unit of measure, a line of consistent length, around which other marks are organized. This is not a feature of natural mineral deposits, which have no reason to employ consistent measurement units. And it is not a feature of casual graffiti, which also has no reason to employ consistent measurement units. The use of a consistent unit is characteristic of notation systems that are recording or conveying quantitative or positional information. The second consistent element is repetition with variation. The marks are not random. They are not decorative in the sense of being purely aesthetic. They show the kind of structured repetition that is characteristic of writing or mathematical notation, units that recur, patterns that vary within a recognizable framework, the kind of organization that suggests information is being encoded rather than images being depicted. The third consistent element is location. The marks consistently appear in specific locations within the cave systems where they have been found, not scattered randomly through the passages, not in the large chambers where one might expect ceremonial activity to have left traces. They appear at decision points, at junctions, at locations where passages meet, divide, or intersect with other passages. This is exactly where you would put navigational information if you were marking a tunnel network for users who needed to find their way through it. The fourth consistent element is the treatment of the surface on which they appear. In every location where the marks have been found and carefully documented, the surface shows evidence of preparation, smoothing, sometimes what appears to be the application of a coating or treatment that provided a better surface for marking. The underlying rock was worked before the marks were made. This implies planning, tool use, a deliberate and organized process. Taken together, these 4 elements don't look like incidental cave art. They don't look like shamanic markings. They don't look like any category of prehistoric American cultural expression that the existing literature adequately describes. They look like exactly what the informal network of researchers has been quietly suggesting they might be for the better part of 2 decades. They look like a writing system, or more precisely, like a navigational notation system, a system designed to guide users through a network of underground passages with functional, practical information about what lay ahead. This is enormous. If it is what it appears to be, it suggests that whoever built and used the tunnel network had a sufficiently complex organizational and communicational system to support the development and consistent application of a notation system across an enormous geographic area. It suggests a level of institutional coherence, a civilization in the real sense of the word, that the standard model of pre-Columbian North America does not allow for. And it has implications that extend far beyond the academic question of what the tunnels are. It raises the question of who made them. And that question leads somewhere deeply unexpected. Here is where the story becomes genuinely, uncomfortably complex. Because the question of who built the tunnels leads not to one answer, but to several competing possibilities, each of which is supported by a different body of evidence, and none of which fits comfortably within the standard historical framework. Possibility 1 is the deep indigenous hypothesis. This is the most parsimonious explanation in terms of requiring the fewest disruptions to existing historical models, though it still requires significant revisions. Under this hypothesis, the tunnel network was constructed over an extraordinarily long period of time by indigenous North American populations, whose cultural complexity and organizational sophistication have been systematically underestimated by Western archaeology. The builders were here. They evolved here. They developed the technologies required over the long span of deep time that genetic and archaeological evidence increasingly suggests was available to them. And the reason we don't see more evidence of their civilization is partly because much of it was underground, and partly because a series of large-scale disruptions, climate events, disease, social collapse, deliberate destruction, erased the surface record while the underground record survived. This possibility is supported by the geographic specificity of indigenous oral traditions, which encode detailed knowledge of underground systems in ways that could only come from direct, sustained, intimate familiarity with those systems. It is supported by the evidence for the long-term occupation of the Americas that pushes human presence back to timescales compatible with the development of significant tunnel infrastructure, and it is supported by the practical logic of building in stone and underground in a landscape where climate volatility, flood, and other surface disruptions would have provided strong incentives to put your most durable infrastructure where the weather couldn't reach it. Possibility 2 is what researchers have called the maritime contact hypothesis. This is more controversial, but is supported by a growing body of physical and genetic evidence. Under this hypothesis, the cultural and technological complexity that the tunnels imply did not develop in total isolation. There was contact, sustained contact, across ocean routes that conventional history has been reluctant to acknowledge between North America and cultures elsewhere in the world. Cultures with developed traditions of stoneworking, cultures with developed traditions of underground construction, cultures with notation systems and organizational complexity of the type the tunnel evidence implies. The evidence for pre-Columbian contact between the Americas and other parts of the world has been accumulating steadily for decades. Genetic analysis has found Asian genetic signatures in South American populations that predate European contact by thousands of years. Crop plants native to the Americas have been found at pre-Columbian sites in Polynesia and New Zealand. Artifacts that appear to be of South American or Central American origin have turned up in archaeological contexts across the Pacific. And in North America, specifically, there is a persistent tradition of finding artifacts in archaeological contexts whose material or construction is inconsistent with known indigenous North American technology. Under the maritime contact hypothesis, the tunnel network's construction was influenced by, or in some cases directly connected to, knowledge traditions that came from outside the Americas. The notation system found in the tunnels might therefore be related to notation systems from other parts of the world. The engineering techniques might reflect knowledge imported or adapted from elsewhere. Possibility 3 is the most difficult to engage with in a context where one wants to be taken seriously, but it is also the one that a small but persistent body of physical evidence seems to support. And that is the possibility that the tunnel network is older than the current human occupation of the Americas. Not built by a later civilization, however ancient, built by something that was here before. This possibility sounds immediately implausible until you look at some specific pieces of evidence that have no good explanation within the frameworks provided by possibilities 1 and 2. There are sections of tunnel network in the American Southwest where the geological evidence for the age of the construction, based on the formations that have grown on and over the modified surfaces, suggests timescales that predate any human occupation of the Americas, even under the most generous archaeological revisions. These are not mainstream findings, they are not published in peer-reviewed journals, but they have been made by people with the geological expertise to interpret formation dates, and they have been made consistently enough across independent analyses that they cannot simply be dismissed as measurement error. If these dating estimates are correct, then whatever built those sections of the tunnel network was not human, at least not human in the sense we typically mean by that word. Let me tell you about Utah, because what was found in Utah in the decade between 2010 and 2020 is, in the estimation of the researchers who know about it, the most significant discovery in the entire body of evidence for the American tunnel network, and it is almost entirely unknown to the general public. The discovery begins with a water resource survey. The Utah Division of Water Resources had been conducting ground-penetrating radar surveys in a remote section of the Colorado Plateau to map subsurface water features. The surveys were routine, the area was remote. The data was supposed to help with planning for drought mitigation infrastructure. The data came back wrong. Not wrong in the sense that the equipment malfunctioned. Wrong in the sense that what the radar was showing beneath the ground did not match what the geology of the area predicted. There were voids, large voids, in locations and at depths where voids were not expected, and the voids had boundaries that were, in the data, almost too regular, too consistent, too geometrically organized. The water resource people filed their report and noted the anomalies, standard procedure. And then, several months later, the report made its way to someone who knew what they were looking at. That person was a geophysicist, not affiliated with any government agency, working independently on a project that is not relevant to this story. He saw the data and immediately understood that the voids in the ground-penetrating radar survey were not geological features. They were chambers, connected chambers, an underground complex. He did not act on it immediately. He spent several months cross-referencing the radar data with geological surveys, historical cave surveys, indigenous land records, and the informal documentation network that by this point had become something of a loose research community. What he found in that cross-referencing confirmed his initial interpretation and went further than he had expected. The voids revealed by the radar were connected to known cave systems in the region. The geometry of the connections matched the navigational logic he had seen described in documentation from other locations. The size of the chambers was consistent with what had been described by cavers who had found anomalous chambers in other states. And at one specific location within the complex, the radar data showed something that he could not initially explain, a feature in the ground-penetrating radar data that appeared to be, in his own carefully cautious words, consistent with a large manufactured object, not a rock formation, not a geological feature, something that had a material composition different from its surroundings and a shape that suggested it had been made rather than deposited. What was the object? He doesn't know. The radar data can tell you that something is there and can give you a rough sense of its size and material composition relative to its surroundings. It cannot tell you what it is. To find out what it is, you have to go there. Getting there required crossing private land. Getting across the private land required conversations that took time. And during the time those conversations were taking place, something happened that introduced a complication the researcher had not anticipated. The land in question was acquired by a federal agency, not condemned, not seized, acquired, in a transaction that was processed through normal land management channels and that, on paper, looks entirely routine. The land was categorized as requiring management for conservation purposes. Access protocols were established, and the specific section of the land that covered the ground-penetrating radar anomaly was classified in a way that restricted access for research purposes, pending a comprehensive environmental survey. That environmental survey, as of the last publicly available information, has not been completed. The anomaly has not been investigated in person. The manufactured object, if that is what it is, sits beneath the Colorado Plateau, surrounded by federal land, under a classification that makes independent access effectively impossible. The researcher who found it has not given up. He has continued to work with whatever data he can access remotely. He has continued to compare notes with others in the informal network, and he has reached a conclusion that he articulates carefully, with all appropriate qualifications, but that he will articulate on the record to people who ask him directly. He believes the feature in the radar data is an artifact, something made, something old, something that whoever classified that land did not want anyone going to look at directly. Whether that belief reflects the reality of what is underground in Utah is something that cannot be confirmed without physical investigation. But the pattern of what happened after the data was filed, the land acquisition, the access restriction, the unfinished environmental survey, is a pattern that is consistent with other cases where anomalous discoveries have been followed by official action that effectively takes them off the table. Let me be specific about how the official world has responded to the accumulating evidence for the American Tunnel Network, because the response, or rather the non-response, is itself a significant piece of the story. The Smithsonian Institution, which is the primary repository for North American archaeological materials and which has enormous institutional influence over what gets taken seriously in American archaeology, has a record with anomalous discoveries that is worth examining. Researchers have documented case after case where physical evidence of anomalous complexity, skulls with unusual cranial morphology, artifacts with unusual material composition, physical features in archaeological sites that suggest greater sophistication than the standard model allows, have been submitted to the Smithsonian and have subsequently disappeared from view, not debunked, not conclusively explained, simply absorbed into an institutional process that doesn't produce public output. This is documented. This is not conspiracy speculation. There are letters. There are accession records. There are the documented accounts of researchers who submitted materials and subsequently could not locate them in the Smithsonian's records. The institution is large, its records are extensive and not always accessible, and there is a long history of researchers noting that the Smithsonian's curatorial priorities seem to consistently favor evidence that fits the standard model over evidence that challenges it. In the specific case of the tunnel systems, there have been several moments when official engagement seemed possible. A report submitted in the late 1990s by a caving organization that had documented anomalous features in a Texas cave system. A proposal for a comprehensive survey of the Ozark cave anomalies submitted by a regional university in the early 2000s. A request for funding to investigate the Utah ground-penetrating radar anomaly that was circulated through federal research channels in 2016. None of these produced official engagement. The Texas report was acknowledged and filed. The Ozark survey proposal was declined for funding. The Utah investigation request was declined on the grounds that the area in question required environmental assessment before research access could be permitted. The federal land management agencies that administer much of the land above the known or suspected tunnel network sections have a legal obligation under the National Historic Preservation Act to document and protect archaeological sites on federal land. That obligation requires, among other things, that anomalous features that be investigated when there is evidence suggesting archaeological significance. The ground-penetrating radar data from Utah provides exactly that kind of evidence, and yet the formal investigation required by law has not been conducted. The land sits protected from the kind of independent research that might answer the questions the data raises, and the official process that should be moving toward investigation appears to be at a permanent standstill. This is the official non-response, not an active denial, not a formal debunking, just a sustained institutional inertia that effectively keeps the most significant questions from being answered through official channels. The reasons for that inertia are a matter of speculation, but the most straightforward explanation is also the most uncomfortable one. The people who would be responsible for investigating these anomalies, who work within institutions that have invested heavily in a particular interpretation of American prehistory, have powerful professional incentives not to find anything that would require them to revise that interpretation. This is not unique to archaeology. It is a feature of how institutional science operates in every field. But in American archaeology, where the standard model has deep political and cultural stakes tied to questions of indigenous rights, land ownership, and national identity, the incentives to maintain the consensus are particularly strong. and the anomalies being suppressed or ignored are particularly significant. This is the part of the story that none of the official accounts will tell you, and that even most of the independent researchers approach with notable caution, because it is the part that moves from the physical evidence of the tunnel systems into the stranger territory of what the tunnels were used for and what may still be associated with them. Let me start with something that can be documented. Across multiple locations in the American Southwest, in documented cave exploration going back decades, there are accounts of light, not the light of someone else's torch or helmet lamp, not bioluminescence, which is a real phenomenon in some cave systems, but which has a distinctive character that experienced cavers recognize immediately, something else. A faint light source that does not come from the surface, does not come from other explorers, and does not have an obvious physical explanation. These accounts exist in caver logs, in expedition reports, in the personal notes of researchers who considered themselves entirely rational and were baffled by what they were recording. A glow from a passage that goes in the direction of unexplored tunnel. Light that, when approached, appears to recede. Illumination of specific features, specific markings, specific locations in the tunnel systems that seems to serve a purpose without having an apparent source. In several accounts, the light is described as appearing in conjunction with the navigation markers, the incised markings at junctions and decision points in the tunnel networks, as if the markers themselves are the source, or as if something is illuminating them specifically. This sounds like it moves well beyond the physical into the supernatural, and maybe it does. But before we dismiss it, it is worth considering what we know about ancient engineering capabilities in the context of tunnel systems. The Romans built aqueducts and tunnels with extraordinary precision, using only the surveying instruments available to them. Ancient Egyptians moved stone through underground passages using mirror systems that channeled sunlight deep into the earth. Ancient mining operations in multiple cultures used sophisticated ventilation systems that moved air through complex underground networks in controlled ways. Could an ancient civilization that built a continental tunnel network have incorporated light management into its design? Optical systems that channeled or reflected natural light into specific underground locations. Materials with luminescent properties that could be embedded in specific sections of wall or applied to specific markings. We cannot say yes with confidence, but we also cannot say no, and the consistent accounts of anomalous light in these specific tunnel systems from independent observers across different periods and different locations constitute a body of testimony that deserves more than dismissal. What we can say with confidence is that the accounts of anomalous light are associated with the same locations that show other anomalies. The same chambers with worked floors and smooth walls, the same junctions with incised navigational markings, the same sections of tunnel network that show evidence of deliberate construction rather than natural formation. Whatever the light is, it is consistently associated with the most anomalous features of the most anomalous sections of these systems. And that association is, at minimum, deeply interesting. There is something else that appears in multiple accounts from deep within these tunnel systems, and it is even harder to discuss in a framework that aspires to rigor. But it is present in enough independent accounts from credible observers that ignoring it would itself be a kind of intellectual dishonesty. The accounts describe the sense of presence, the overwhelming visceral experienced in the body sense that the tunnel systems are occupied, not in the sense that another human explorer is nearby, which would be detectable through sound and light and the various sensory cues that cave explorers learn to use. In a different sense, a sense that the space itself is inhabited, animate, aware of the presence of the visitor in a way that doesn't have a physical explanation. Experienced cavers are generally rational, practically minded people. They work in environments where hallucination and misperception can get you killed, so they develop strong habits of checking their perceptions against reality. When they describe a sense of presence in specific locations in the tunnel systems, they are not describing something they have imagined. They are describing a persistent, reproducible, verifiable experience that multiple independent observers have reported from the same locations. What it means is another question. Indigenous traditions provide a framework for understanding it that is coherent within their own terms. The tunnels are not empty. They have never been empty. The beings who inhabit them, whose names and natures vary between traditions, are as real as the rock, Western materialism does not have a framework for this that is equally coherent. But Western materialism has frequently been wrong about what the universe contains. And the convergence of physical evidence of sophisticated tunnel construction with indigenous traditions of underground inhabitation, with independent observer accounts of anomalous light and presence in specific underground locations, is a parter convergence that demands a more open-minded investigation than it has so far received. We need to talk about the mound builders, not as a mysterious lost race, which is how they were often described in the 19th century with frankly racist undertones of impossibility, that indigenous Americans could have built such things, but as what they actually were, an extraordinarily complex, widespread, and in many respects still poorly understood set of cultures that built earthwork monuments across eastern North America on a scale that, when you actually look at the numbers, should stop your breath. The Hopewell culture, centered in Ohio but with influence and trade connections extending from the Rocky Mountains to the Gulf of Mexico to the Atlantic coast, built geometric earthworks of extraordinary precision and scale. The Newark earthworks in Ohio, the most extensive of these sites, covered 4 square miles. 4 square miles of carefully engineered earthen walls, enclosures and causeways, laid out with geometric precision that modern surveys have shown to be accurate to fractions of a degree. The Great Cirques, the Octagon earthworks, the Wright earthworks, these structures were aligned to lunar standstills, to solar events, to specific astronomical phenomena, with a precision that required sophisticated mathematical knowledge and sustained observational records. The Adena culture, which preceded Hopewell in the Ohio Valley, built burial mounds whose sophistication of construction and the richness of the grave goods they contain suggests a social complexity and a degree of specialized production that goes well beyond what the standard model of Eastern woodland cultures typically implies, and the Mississippian culture, which succeeded Hopewell and built Cahokia at its center, extended across the entire southeastern United States with a network of connected mound centers that functioned as nodes in a regional, political, and economic system of genuine complexity. What connected all of these cultures to each other, and what connected them to the tunnel network hypothesis, is the underground dimension of their ceremonial and practical life. The mound builders did not build only upward, they also built downward. Or rather, they used the underground in ways that the archaeological record, which focuses primarily on surface and near-surface features, has systematically underrepresented. Caves within the territory of mound builder cultures show extensive evidence of use, not just occasional use, but sustained, organized use by people who clearly understood them well. The cave systems of the Appalachians, the Ozarks, the limestone regions of Indiana and Illinois and Kentucky show evidence of human activity going back thousands of years. Activity that in many cases has characteristics consistent with what has been found in the Southwest and in other parts of the tunnel network. Worked surfaces, modified passages, evidence of systematic navigation rather than casual exploration, and in some cases, very specific connections between the surface earthwork geometry and underground features. The geometric alignments of Hopewell earthworks, when extended below the surface using the same mathematical principles, point to specific underground locations in ways that have not been fully studied, but that suggest the above-ground monuments and the below-ground network may have been conceived as parts of a single integrated system. If that is correct, the mound builders were not just building ceremonial landscapes on the surface, they were integrating those ceremonial landscapes with an existing underground infrastructure. They knew the tunnels were there, they were using the tunnels, and the geometric sophistication of their surface earthworks reflects a mathematical and engineering tradition that is entirely consistent with the sophistication of tunnel construction the physical evidence suggests. This changes the picture of mound builder civilization significantly. Not a mysterious lost race, not a romanticized noble past, but a real, sophisticated, deeply interesting civilization that was operating within and upon an underground network that it had inherited from something older, that it understood and used, and whose significance it encoded in surface monuments that have survived to the present day. Around 800 to 900 years ago, something happened. Across the entire geography of ancient North American civilization, there was a simultaneous and catastrophic collapse. not one culture failing while others continued. Multiple cultures, across a vast geographic area, collapsing within a few centuries of each other. Cahokia, as mentioned, was abandoned. The Chaco Canyon system, the great houses of the Four Corners region, abandoned. The ancestral Puebloan civilizations of the Colorado Plateau contracted dramatically. The mound builder cultures of the East fragmented and diminished. The long-distance trade networks that had connected copper from Lake Superior to ceremonial centers in Florida, these networks contracted and in many cases ceased entirely. The explanations offered by mainstream archaeology focus primarily on drought. The medieval warm period, followed by the Little Ice Age, disrupted rainfall patterns across North America in ways that would have stressed agricultural systems and population centers. There is genuine evidence for this. The tree ring record is clear. There were severe, sustained droughts in the American Southwest that coincide with the ancestral Puebloan collapse. The evidence from Cahokia's region suggests agricultural stress as well, but drought alone is not a fully satisfying explanation for a collapse this widespread and this simultaneous. Droughts are regional phenomena. The cultures that collapsed were not all in the same region. The stress that collapsed Cahokia in the upper Mississippi Valley was not the same drought that affected the Chacoan system in New Mexico. For drought to explain both, you need a level of climatic disruption that is larger than the evidence for any single drought event supports. Other factors are in play, social factors, political factors, and possibly factors that we don't have a good name for, because they involve systems whose existence the standard model doesn't acknowledge. If the tunnel network was a real continental infrastructure, if it was being actively maintained and used for transportation and communication across the vast geography of North American civilization at its peak, then the failure of that network, for whatever reason, would have had consequences that ripple across every civilization connected to it, simultaneously, in ways that look like independent collapse to an observer who doesn't know the network existed. This is speculation, but it is speculation that has a specific testable implication. If the tunnel network was damaged or abandoned at the same time as the surface civilizations collapsed, the physical evidence in the tunnels should reflect that. There should be evidence of abandonment, of blockage, of the cessation of maintenance at a period consistent with the late 12th or early 13th century. Researchers who have documented tunnel systems in the relevant regions report that there is exactly this kind of evidence: passages that show signs of deliberate blocking, chambers with evidence of final use events, accumulated materials that suggest the last people to use the space were closing it for a reason, sections of tunnel where the maintenance activities that kept earlier sections clear and navigable simply stopped at a point in the geological timeline that is consistent with the surface civilization collapses. The tunnels were abandoned, not destroyed, not erased, abandoned, sealed in some cases, left alone in others, and over the centuries that followed, they filled in the collective memory of the surviving surface populations in the same way that the surface sites did, slowly, imperfectly, with enough retained memory to sustain oral traditions that kept the knowledge alive in encoded form. The Hopi emergence tradition, the Cherokee memory of the Nunahi, the Lakota tradition of Wind Cave, the Tohono O'odham accounts of desert passages. All of these are memory, carefully encoded and transmitted across centuries of a reality that had ceased to function as a lived infrastructure, but remained as a cultural presence. The tunnels were gone from daily life, but not from the cultural imagination of the peoples whose ancestors had used them. And then, gradually, painstakingly, through the efforts of cavers and independent researchers, and the occasional geologist or archaeologist willing to follow the evidence past the boundaries of what was professionally safe, they began to re-emerge, not from the ground, from the documentary record, from the accumulated weight of evidence that had been quietly building for decades, photographed, mapped, measured, sketched, compared, cross-referenced, and slowly, haltingly, beginning to be understood. Not everyone who has pursued this research has done so without consequences. This is not a story of dramatic persecution. Nobody has been jailed for studying ancient tunnels. Nobody has been harmed in ways that can be definitively attributed to official suppression. But there is a pattern of professional consequences that, again, is sufficiently consistent across independent cases to constitute a real phenomenon rather than coincidence. Academic researchers who have published work suggesting greater complexity in pre-Columbian North American civilization than the standard model allows have consistently found that the publication process becomes difficult. Peer reviewers who engage not with the evidence, but with the implications. Editors who suggest that the conclusions go beyond what the data supports, not because they actually do, but because the conclusions are uncomfortable. Funding that dries up. Positions that aren't renewed. Collaborators who quietly distance themselves to protect their own careers. This is not the behavior of a coordinated conspiracy. It is the behavior of an institutional culture that has strong incentives to maintain its own consensus, and that exercises those incentives through the normal mechanisms of professional life. The result is the same as formal suppression would produce, but it is more durable because it doesn't require ongoing active management. The system does it itself. A geologist who in the 1990s published a paper in a regional journal analyzing the anomalous features of modified passages in the Texas cave systems found himself unable to publish in mainstream venues for several years. Afterward, his work was not wrong, it was not debunked. It was simply not cited, not engaged with, effectively frozen out of the conversation. He continued his work, but privately, outside the academic publication system. His findings are available. They are detailed, rigorous, and damning. They are read by people in the informal research network. They are not read by most professional geologists. An archaeologist, who in the early 2000s attempted to bring the Ozark anomalies to the attention of her institution, found that her proposal for a funded investigation was not declined on the merits, but was simply not processed. The paperwork went into a departmental review process and did not come out. When she followed up, she was told the proposal needed revision. When she submitted revisions, she was told it was under review. The review never concluded. The proposal was eventually withdrawn when she left the institution for other reasons. She did not connect her departure to the proposal, but she noted in a personal communication that the experience had made her aware of the limits of what her institution was able to engage with. A caver and independent researcher who had accumulated one of the most extensive documentation archives of tunnel anomalies in the Southwest, had his computer equipment seized in a 2014 search conducted under the authority of a federal warrant. The stated grounds for the warrant were unrelated to his cave research. The computer equipment was eventually returned. Most of the data on it was intact, but the experience left him, in his own description, more cautious about maintaining physical backups and about whom he discussed his work with. These are individual cases. They could each be explained as coincidence or as the result of factors unrelated to the research subject. But they are consistent with a pattern, and the pattern is consistent with what you would expect to see if there were powerful institutional interests invested in preventing serious engagement with this evidence from becoming mainstream. This is where the story takes a turn that many listeners will not expect, because the evidence for American tunnel systems does not exist in isolation. There is a parallel body of evidence, equally suppressed and equally significant, from the other side of the Pacific. And when you lay the two bodies of evidence against each other, the convergence is extraordinary. In Australia, there is a tradition that goes back to the first contact between indigenous Australians and European settlers of underground spaces that exceed what geology would predict. The cave systems of the Nullarbor Plain, which extend beneath the largest limestone plateau in the world, are among the longest and most extensive cave systems on Earth. Parts of them have been explored. Large parts remain unexplored, and the accounts of what explorers have found in the unexplored sections of the Nullarbor system carry echoes that are, to anyone who has been following the American evidence, strongly familiar. Smooth walls, level floors, passages that are too regular to be purely natural, markings at junctions, evidence of modification at depths, and in sections where modification by known recent indigenous populations would have required navigation and access capabilities that go considerably beyond what the archaeological record of the region suggests. Aboriginal tradition is specific about the underground in Australia in ways that parallel indigenous American traditions in their specificity and in the geographic accuracy of their references. The dreaming, the foundational framework of Aboriginal cosmology, is not purely a spiritual system. it is also a navigational and geographic system. The songlines, the paths that crisscross the Australian continent and that encode geographic and cultural information in sung sequences, include underground dimensions, places where the songline goes underground, where the dreaming ancestor entered the earth and continued underground, where the surface world and the underground world intersect. Specific locations identified in Aboriginal songline traditions as underground intersection points have been investigated by researchers and have consistently been found to sit above significant cave system features. Not always accessible cave system features, but features that ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies can identify as present. The convergence between American and Australian evidence extends further. Both traditions include accounts of beings specifically associated with underground spaces. Both traditions include accounts of underground light. Both traditions include the sense of a continental-scale underground infrastructure that was once functional and is now in a state of abandonment or dormancy. Both traditions include the sense that the underground spaces are not inert geology, but living, inhabited, significant places. The physical evidence in both cases shows the same categories of anomaly: modified passages, worked surfaces, navigational markings, connections between cave systems that appear deliberate rather than geological. And in both cases, the official response to researchers who document these anomalies has been the same pattern of institutional non-engagement. What are we to make of this? A few possibilities suggest themselves. One is that the builders of the American tunnel network were also present in Australia, that the continental-scale infrastructure we are beginning to document in North America was part of something even larger, a global network, a civilization or a set of connected civilizations that built underground infrastructure on multiple continents, that had some kind of connection across the Pacific, and that left traces in both places that are now being slowly pieced together by researchers working from opposite sides of the ocean. Another is that both bodies of evidence reflect a much more ancient global phenomenon, that the underground infrastructure we are seeing traces of in North America and Australia, and potentially in other places that a global survey would reveal, was built not by historical or proto-historical civilizations, but by something that preceded them, something so ancient that the geological record we are trying to use to date it is itself inadequate to the task. A third is that the parallels are real, but the connection is coincidental, that the same human impulses toward underground use and modification, the same practical needs for underground infrastructure, the same engineering solutions to underground construction problems, were arrived at independently on different continents, by different civilizations at different times. This third possibility is the most comfortable and the least satisfying, because the specificity of the parallels, the markings at junctions, the worked surfaces, the anomalous light, the indigenous traditions of underground inhabited spaces, is not the kind of specificity that tends to arise from coincidental, independent development. It is the kind of specificity that usually reflects shared origin or sustained contact. Let me step back from the human stories for a moment and let the geology speak. Because the geological record is one of the bodies of evidence that has been least examined in relation to the tunnel systems, and that, when examined, produces some of the most striking results. The karst geology of North America, the limestone and dolomite formations that produce the extensive cave systems of the South and Midwest, has been forming since the early Cambrian period, roughly 500 million years ago. The caves that exist within those formations have been forming through water dissolution of limestone, a process called speleogenesis, for periods ranging from millions of years to tens of thousands of years. The specific timing of cave formation can be estimated from the growth of speleothems, the cave formations, stalactites, stalagmites, flowstones, that grow in conditions of water availability at predictable rates. This is important because it provides a dating tool for modifications to cave passages. When a cave passage is modified by human or intentional activity, that modification leaves a surface, and if the conditions in the cave continue to support speleothem growth, formations will begin to grow on that modified surface. The age of those formations gives you a minimum age for the modification. The modification is at least as old as the oldest formation growing on it. In some cases, significantly older, because formations don't always begin growing immediately after a surface is exposed. Researchers who have applied this dating logic to the modified passage surfaces in the American tunnel systems have obtained results that, in multiple cases, suggest modification dates that predate any known indigenous American civilization, and in some cases, predate any known human occupation of the Americas at all. These results are not uniformly dramatic. Many of the dated surfaces suggest modifications within the broadly plausible range of indigenous American prehistory, which, when properly expanded to account for the deep time occupation evidence now available, covers a span of tens of thousands of years. But there are specific surfaces in specific sections of the tunnel system where the speleothem dating suggests modification at periods that no honest geological interpretation can place within the range of human activity on this continent. One specific case, documented in the independent research literature but not in any mainstream geological publication, involves a section of modified passage in the Ozark cave system, where flowstone formations growing on a modified wall surface have been dated by uranium-thorium isotope analysis to a period approximately 80,000 years ago. This does not mean the modification happened 80,000 years ago. It means the modification happened before 80,000 years ago. The modification is at least that old. 80,000 years ago, modern humans had not left Africa. The Americas, by any credible model of human prehistory, were not occupied by Homo sapiens 80,000 years ago. There are various ways to handle this result. You can question the analysis. You can suggest that the formation was not actually growing on the modified surface, but on a natural surface that only appeared modified. You can invoke methodological error. These are the options available within the framework of conventional prehistory. Or you can take the result at face value and follow it to its logical conclusion, which is that something modified that passage wall before modern humans were anywhere near North America, and that something, whatever it was capable of the kind of deliberate, purposeful, sustained effort that modification implies. That conclusion is extraordinarily uncomfortable. It is also, if the geological dating is accurate, unavoidable. There is a specific location. I will not give coordinates. I will not name the state with enough specificity to allow it to be pinpointed. But there is a specific location within the American tunnel network where something was found that changes the character of this entire story. It was found by a caver in the early 2010s who was pushing into an unmapped section of a cave system in the American South. The passage she was following was approximately 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, roughly the consistent profile documented in other anomalous passages. It had been going in a remarkably consistent direction for approximately 200 meters from the nearest known cave chamber. The floor showed the same leveling evidence found elsewhere. The walls showed occasional tool marks and the familiar notches at shoulder height. And then the passage opened, not dramatically, not into a vast chamber, but into a space slightly larger than the passage, a widening, perhaps 8 feet across, perhaps 10 feet high. And in that widening, on the floor, was something that she immediately photographed and that she spent the next several hours trying to understand. It was a structure, approximately 4 feet high, approximately 8 feet across in its widest dimension, made of stone, not stone that had fallen from the ceiling, not a natural deposit. Stone that had been assembled, fitted together, constructed. The construction was not in the style of any known indigenous American building tradition. It was not adobe. It was not the dry stack masonry of the Pueblo cultures. It was not the mud mortar construction of the mound builder tradition. It was something else. Shaped stones, fitted with a precision that was visible even by helmet lamp light, mortared with a material that appeared to be some kind of processed mineral compound. Built in a shape that was not immediately recognizable as a domestic structure, a granary, a ceremonial platform, or any of the standard functional categories of ancient construction. She photographed it from every angle she could manage. She touched the surfaces and noted the texture. She noticed that the mortar compound was harder than the surrounding limestone, which is not a property of most naturally occurring mineral compounds. She looked for organic material, something she could potentially date. She found nothing organic. She made her way out of the cave. She sat in her car for an extended period before driving. She called the person in the informal research network that she most trusted. And then she did what the informal network's accumulated experience had taught its members to do when they found something significant. She documented everything, kept the coordinates private, and waited. The structure was visited subsequently by two other researchers. Both confirmed the original documentation. Neither has provided the location to anyone outside the informal network. All three are aware that without physical access, independent confirmation, and formal investigation, what they have found is, in the formal evidentiary sense, unverifiable. But all three have said privately that what they found in that widening in the South American cave system is not a natural feature. It is not a known indigenous structure type. It is built in a way that implies sophisticated masonry tradition and engineering knowledge. And it is located at a depth and in a position within the tunnel network that makes any recent construction or placement essentially impossible. What it is, they do not claim to know. What it is not, they are considerably more confident about. It is not nothing. Before we reach the conclusion of this story, we need to address one more dimension of the tunnel network evidence, one that connects the underground geography to the sky above. Because the builders of the tunnel network, whoever they were, appear to have been as sophisticated in their astronomical knowledge as they were in their engineering. The navigational markings found in the tunnel junctions, the incised geometric systems described earlier in this story, have been analyzed by several independent researchers with backgrounds in mathematics and astronomy. And what they have found, tentatively and with appropriate qualifications, is evidence of astronomical encoding. The markings appear to encode directional information that is not simply cardinal, not simply north, south, east, west. The angular relationships between marking elements appear in several documented cases to correspond to celestial angles. The positions of specific stars or constellations relative to specific horizon points at specific times of year. The kind of astronomical encoding that would allow a user of the tunnel network to determine not just where they were in physical space, but where they were in time. What season, what month, perhaps what phase of longer astronomical cycles. This is consistent with what we know about the astronomical sophistication of ancient North American cultures on the surface. The Newark earthworks are aligned to the lunar standstill cycle, an 18.6-year cycle of the moon's orbital shift. Cahokia's Woodhenge is aligned to solar events. The Chaco Canyon complex incorporates solar and lunar alignments into its architecture at a level of precision that has astonished modern researchers. If the surface monuments encode astronomical information, it would not be surprising that the underground navigational system does the same. A tunnel network spanning a continent would need some way for users to orient themselves that didn't depend on visible landmarks or the position of the sun. Astronomical encoding, if you had the knowledge to read it, would provide exactly that. A way to know where you were in space and time from information encoded in the marks on the walls around you. This level of integration between surface astronomical monuments, underground navigational infrastructure, and encoded notation systems implies a civilization of extraordinary coherence. A civilization with sophisticated astronomy, sophisticated engineering, sophisticated communication systems, and the organizational capacity to maintain all three across a continental geography. A civilization that the standard historical model has no category for because it is operating at a level of complexity that the standard model reserves for much later periods and much better documented cultures. But the evidence is there, fragmented, scattered, in cave documentation and caver logs and independent research publications and informal network communications, slowly being assembled into a coherent picture. The picture of a civilization that built under the earth, watched the stars, mapped the continent, and left its marks in places that only the most persistent and curious explorers have found. The question of what official America knows about the tunnel systems is one that can only be answered indirectly, because by definition, if there is classified or suppressed knowledge of significant pre-Columbian underground infrastructure, we would not have direct access to documentation of that knowledge. But there are indicators, there are patterns in official behavior that suggest awareness of something that is not being publicly acknowledged. The pattern of land acquisitions over underground anomaly locations is one indicator. The rapid and unexplained federal acquisition of land above the Utah ground-penetrating radar anomaly is the most recent and perhaps the clearest example. But researchers who have systematically cross-referenced federal land management records with the documented locations of tunnel network anomalies have found a statistically improbable concentration of federal land holdings, federal land acquisitions over or near the most significant anomaly locations. This could be coincidence. The federal government owns vast tracts of land in the American West, but the specific concentration of recent acquisitions in the last 30 years over specific anomaly locations that were themselves identified relatively recently by independent researchers is a pattern that coincidence alone does not fully explain. The pattern of archaeological site designation is another indicator. Certain cave systems that contain anomalous features have been designated as archaeological sites in ways that restrict independent research access while also not producing any official research output. The designation provides a legal basis for restricting access without the designation needing to produce the investigation that legally accompanies it. The result is the same as if the sites had been formally classified. They are inaccessible to independent researchers without being officially acknowledged as anything other than protected natural resources. The pattern of funding and institutional behavior in academic archaeology is a third indicator. The consistent decline of research proposals, the non-citation of anomalous findings, the professional consequences for researchers who pursue this evidence. These are not characteristics of a field simply moving at its own pace. They are characteristics of a field operating under implicit constraints on what it is permitted to discover. None of this proves that official America has formal classified knowledge of the tunnel network. What it suggests is that there are powerful interests invested in ensuring that this evidence does not reach the level of public and academic attention that would force a formal engagement with its implications. What those implications are, at the most fundamental level, is a rewriting of American prehistory, a rewriting that would affect questions of land rights, of cultural heritage, of national identity, of the very foundation story of what North America is and was. The implications are not just academic, they are political, legal, cultural, and economic, in ways that make institutional resistance thoroughly understandable, even if it is not ultimately defensible. The informal network of researchers who have been building the evidentiary case for the American tunnel network has grown over the past 2 decades. It is not an organization, it has no leadership, no membership list, no formal structure. It is a loose web of relationships between people who share findings, compare notes, and occasionally collaborate on specific investigations. Its members include retired geologists, active cavers, independent historians, indigenous knowledge holders, who have chosen to share specific traditional knowledge with researchers they trust, former academic archaeologists, who have stepped back from institutional life for various reasons, and a scattering of other specialists, whose skills are relevant to specific aspects of the evidence. They are not a single-minded group. They disagree about interpretation. They are cautious about claims that go beyond what the evidence can directly support. They are aware of the ways in which fringe archaeology has damaged the credibility of legitimate anomalous research through sensationalism and methodological sloppiness. And they are, individually and collectively, deeply committed to doing this right. Some of them are working toward a moment when the evidence is strong enough and sufficiently cross-verified to support a serious, credentialed, peer-reviewed publication that cannot be dismissed through the normal mechanisms of institutional non-engagement. They know what that moment would require: a comprehensive dataset covering multiple locations with consistent methodology, cross-referenced against the geological, indigenous, traditional, historical, and physical evidence, presented in a format that the academic mainstream can engage with on its own terms. They are not there yet, but they are closer than they have ever been. Others in the network have concluded that the academic publication route is not available to them, that the institutional constraints are too strong to allow it. They are working toward public disclosure, the accumulation and release of documentation in formats that bypass the academic gatekeeping process. Not sensationally, not through channels that would invite easy dismissal, but in a form that puts the raw evidence in front of the public and lets the public draw its own conclusions. Both approaches have merit. Both face significant obstacles, and both are being pursued simultaneously by people who are, in many cases, sacrificing professionally and personally to pursue research that most of their colleagues consider at best eccentric and at worst career-destroying. The tunnels will not remain secret indefinitely. The evidence is too widespread, too consistently documented, too deeply embedded in indigenous traditional knowledge, and too physically real to stay confined to an informal network forever. The question is not whether the truth comes out, but how and when and through what kind of disruption. If the American tunnel network is what the evidence suggests it is, the implications unfold across every dimension of our understanding of human history. It means that North America supported a civilization of greater sophistication and greater antiquity than anything currently acknowledged in the mainstream record. A civilization capable of continental-scale infrastructure, sophisticated engineering, astronomical knowledge, notation systems, and organizational complexity sustained across time spans measured in thousands or tens of thousands of years. It means that the indigenous peoples of North America are the inheritors. Whether or not they retain conscious knowledge of it, of a civilizational tradition far deeper and far richer than the colonizers who displaced them were able or willing to acknowledge. The oral traditions, the navigational knowledge encoded in songlines and creation stories and dreaming paths, the geographic specificity of indigenous accounts of underground spaces, these are not myths in the dismissive sense of the word. They are memory, imperfect, encoded, transformed through transmission across generations, but rooted in actual events and actual geography. It means that the story of human civilization on this planet is more complex and more ancient than the conventional model allows. And if that is true for North America, the implications ripple outward. If there was a civilization here at the level the tunnel evidence suggests, operating at that level of sophistication across that span of time, the question of how it connects to other sophisticated ancient civilizations elsewhere in the world becomes urgently important. The questions of contact, of diffusion, of shared origins become not merely interesting, but central to understanding our own past. It means that the ground beneath us is not simply geology, it is history. It is the physical record of minds and intentions and efforts that we have barely begun to understand. And that history is more continuous and more present than we typically imagine. The tunnel network, if it exists at scale, did not disappear when its builders did. It is still there, still extending through the rock, still connecting the places it was built to connect, waiting in the specific way that stone waits, without impatience, without urgency, with the absolute patience of something built to last. And it means that we, the people living above it, have a responsibility that we have not yet taken seriously. The responsibility to look, to investigate, to follow the evidence where it leads, to honor the traditions that have kept this knowledge alive through centuries of suppression and displacement, and to build a picture of the human past that is true, not merely comfortable. Across the American continent, the stories have been talking for a very long time, not loudly, not in the channels where institutional knowledge circulates, but in the traditions, the ceremonies, the songs, the carefully transmitted accounts that have moved from elder to child and from child to elder across generations that the written record doesn't count. The Zuni of New Mexico carry stories of underground cities, not metaphorical cities, actual underground spaces with rooms, with passages, with the kind of organized interior geography that implies construction rather than nature. The Zuni stories are specific about location, specific about what the spaces look like, specific about what happened in them and what stopped happening in them. The Navajo have accounts of the underworld that go beyond the generic creation mythology. They have specific knowledge of passages, specific accounts of what it is like to be underground in the places the passages lead to, the kind of specific phenomenological knowledge that comes from experience rather than imagination. And the Navajo boundaries, the 4 sacred mountains that define Dineta, the traditional Navajo homeland, sit in a geographic relationship to the documented tunnel system locations that is not obviously coincidental. The Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, have traditions of underground spaces that are bound up with their accounts of the little people, the Joga, small beings associated with specific locations in the Appalachian landscape and with the ability to move underground. The Joga are not simply mythological, they are described with enough specificity, enough connection to particular geographic features, that researchers who have taken the descriptions seriously and gone to the locations have found, in several cases, what they were looking for, or at least found evidence consistent with what the descriptions point toward. The Mississippian cultures of the American Southeast, whose surface archaeology includes the great mound complexes of Georgia and Alabama and Tennessee and Mississippi, have indigenous successors who carry oral traditions about those mound complexes that go considerably beyond what the surface archaeology alone can tell us. Traditions that include underground dimensions of the mound sites, underground chambers, underground passages connecting mound centers, the kind of underground infrastructure that would explain both the scale of the mound building project and the nature of the trade networks it supported. These are the stories that survive. They survived the colonial disruption. They survived the deliberate suppression of indigenous cultural practices that characterized American policy for much of the 19th and early 20th centuries. They survived because they were important enough to the communities that carried them, that those communities found ways to keep them alive through times when keeping them alive required courage and sacrifice. And now they are being heard, not with the condescension of an earlier anthropology that treated indigenous tradition as quaint superstition, but as evidence, as data, as the testimony of people whose ancestors knew things that we are only beginning to rediscover. There is a question that sits beneath all of this, and it is a question about the nature of memory itself, about what it means to remember something for thousands of years, about what gets preserved and what gets lost when a civilization collapses and its survivors carry forward what they can. We know that oral traditions can preserve accurate information for extraordinary periods of time. The Australian Aboriginal songlines encode geographic information about coastlines that have been submerged for more than 7,000 years. The accuracy of that information has been verified by modern geological survey. 7,000 years of oral transmission, preserving the coastline position with enough accuracy to be confirmed by modern science. If oral transmission can preserve coastline geography for 7,000 years, it can preserve knowledge of underground passages. It can preserve the specific geographic locations of tunnel entrances, of chambers, of the junctions where the navigational markings were placed. It can preserve descriptions of what the underground spaces looked like, what they were used for, what happened to cause them to be abandoned or sealed. The indigenous traditions that describe the American tunnel network are not, in this light, mythology in the sense of fiction. They are memory in the sense of carefully transmitted experiential knowledge. The Sipapu is a real place. The breathing cave is a real place. The underground passages of the Cherokee traditions point to real geographic features. The desert tunnels of the Tohono O'odham are physically present in the geology of the Sonoran Desert. And if the traditions are preserving real geographic knowledge, they are also likely preserving real historical knowledge. The accounts of when the underground spaces were built, or at least of which people built them or used them most recently before the tradition was established. The accounts of why they were sealed or abandoned. The accounts of what went wrong. These historical accounts are embedded in mythological frameworks that make them hard to extract and analyze as literal history. But the geographic accuracy of the indigenous traditions, demonstrable in the cases where specific locations have been investigated, provides a strong prima facie case for taking the historical content of those traditions seriously as well. The deep structure of memory, the capacity of human oral tradition to preserve real information across vast spans of time, is one of the most underappreciated tools available to the study of deep human history. For a field that routinely decries the absence of written records for pre-Columbian America, archaeology has been remarkably reluctant to engage seriously with the oral records that do exist, that have survived the colonial period, and that carry precisely the kind of information the field claims to need. That reluctance is itself an artifact of an institutional culture with specific assumptions about what counts as evidence and what kinds of testimony are credible. Those assumptions are not neutral, they have histories. They reflect the power dynamics of the colonial period in which Western academic disciplines were formed, and they systematically disadvantage exactly the kinds of evidence that would allow a more complete understanding of American prehistory. Breaking down that reluctance, taking seriously the testimony that indigenous tradition carries, and integrating it with the physical evidence from the tunnel systems, is perhaps the most important methodological shift that the study of this subject requires. I want to spend some time on the physical reality of these tunnels, not the evidence, not the implications, just the experience of what it is to be in them. because I think that experience is part of the story that tends to get lost in analytical discussion. Caves are strange places. Even ordinary caves, the natural ones, the simple karst formations without any of the anomalies we have been discussing, carry a quality that is hard to describe in language built for the surface world. The absence of light is more than the absence of light. It is a presence of its own. The silence is more than the absence of sound. The air moves differently from surface air. The temperature is constant in ways that surface temperature never is. And the sense of the rock around you, the geological time embedded in the formations, in the crystal growth, in the slow drip of water that has been doing what it is doing for longer than human civilization has existed, this sense is powerful in ways that don't fit into standard categories of experience. The anomalous tunnel systems add dimensions to this that push the experience further. The sense that the space was made, that it was made for a purpose, that the purpose was human, or at least intentional, in some form that your body recognizes, even when your analytical mind is uncertain. The passages that are the right size for a human body, without being uncomfortably cramped. The floor that doesn't fight your feet. The junctions that present themselves with a clarity that doesn't feel accidental. And in the specific locations where the markings appear, where the light anomalies have been reported, where the presence has been felt by multiple independent observers, there is something else again. Something that the people who have been there consistently struggle to articulate, and consistently feel compelled to try to articulate anyway. One researcher, a geologist who describes herself as entirely non-spiritual and empirically minded in her approach to everything, said something in a personal interview that has stuck with me as perhaps the most honest attempt to describe it. She said that in certain chambers, in certain passages, she had the experience of being inside something that was not geology, something that was structured, intentional, and in some sense that she found impossible to specify further, aware. She said that she had spent years trying to find a physical explanation for that experience and had not found one that satisfied her. And she said that the experience had changed the way she thought about the relationship between consciousness and the physical world in ways she was still working out. That is not the testimony of someone who has been credulous or sensational about this. That is the testimony of someone who went into the rock with every scientific instinct intact and came out with a question she couldn't answer. The questions that come out of the rock are the most important questions this story raises, not the historical questions, as significant as those are, but the deeper questions about consciousness, about the nature of constructed space, about what it means to build something that persists long after the builders are gone, about what remains in a place where something was made with great intention and where that intention was later withdrawn. Those are the questions that the tunnels ultimately ask, and they are questions that no amount of additional archaeological dating or geological analysis will fully answer. They require a different kind of inquiry, one that takes the experience of being in these spaces as seriously as the measurement of the spaces, one that takes the testimony of those who have felt what is in there as seriously as the documentation of what is physically there. That kind of inquiry is not something the current state of the investigation is well equipped to conduct, but it is, ultimately, the inquiry the tunnels invite. Let me gather up everything we have covered and say plainly where the evidence leads. Not what is proven, not what is certain, but where the evidence, taken seriously and followed honestly, actually points. It points to a tunnel network, real, physical, extensive, deliberately constructed or modified across a continental geography that spans at minimum the American Southwest, the Midwest, the Appalachians, and the Southeast, and that may extend beyond these regions into areas not yet documented. It points to a civilization, or perhaps a succession of civilizations, that built and used this network over a span of time that begins well before any currently acknowledged complex civilization in North America, and that may extend into timescales beyond the current human occupation of the Americas. It points to a level of technological and organizational sophistication in pre-Columbian North America that the standard model cannot accommodate. Engineering capability sufficient to construct continental-scale underground infrastructure, astronomical knowledge sufficient to encode celestial information in navigational marking systems, organizational capacity sufficient to sustain coordinated construction and maintenance across vast geographic distances over very long periods of time. It points to indigenous oral traditions as repositories of genuine historical and geographic knowledge about these systems, knowledge that encodes real information about real places in traditional frameworks that have been systematically undervalued as historical sources. It points to institutional suppression, not necessarily coordinated but effective, of research and evidence that challenges the standard model. Suppression through the normal mechanisms of professional culture, funding control, and publication gatekeeping, supplemented in some cases by more direct official interventions. It points to a parallel body of evidence in Australia, and potentially elsewhere, that suggests the American tunnel network may be a component of something even larger and more significant at a global scale. And it points, ultimately, to the ground beneath our feet as a place that contains more than geology, a place where the deepest questions about human history, human civilization, and perhaps human nature itself are embedded in stone, waiting for us to find the courage and the curiosity to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The truth is underground. It has been there for a very long time, and it is not going anywhere. This is the part of the story where we come back to the surface, where we bring everything we have found underground back into the air and the light and the sensory reality of a world that is, for most of us, the only world we know in our daily lives. The tunnels are down there. Whatever they are, whatever their full story is, they are physically present in the rock beneath this country. They have been present for longer than the nations that lay claim to the surface above them. They predate every political boundary, every legal framework, every institutional structure that currently governs the land over them. And that raises a question that is quietly profound. Who owns them? Not in the legal sense, not in the bureaucratic sense, in the deeper sense. Who is responsible for understanding them? Who is responsible for preserving them? Who holds the obligation to pursue the truth of what they are and to communicate that truth honestly to the people who live above them? The people who have been doing this work, the informal network of cavers and researchers and indigenous knowledge holders and former academics, have been doing it without resources, without official support, without the institutional backing that serious research requires. They have been doing it because the truth matters, because the questions the tunnels raise are the kinds of questions that don't go away when you look away from them, because the experience of being in these spaces, of touching those worked walls, of standing in those leveled chambers, and understanding that someone made this, changes you in ways that make looking away impossible. There will come a moment when this story breaks into public consciousness in a form that demands official engagement. It may come through a dramatic physical discovery that cannot be managed into obscurity. It may come through the kind of sustained, independent documentation that reaches a threshold of credibility that even institutional inertia cannot deflect. It may come through a change in the political and cultural landscape that makes the acknowledgement of indigenous historical knowledge more central to official American life. When it comes, it will not look like a simple triumph of truth over suppression. It will look complicated. There will be debates about interpretation. There will be disputes about rights and access, and whose knowledge has authority. There will be a long process of integrating what the tunnels reveal with everything else we think we know about human history. But it will come, because the tunnels are there, and the evidence is real, and the truth, however long it takes, has a way of finding the surface. Tonight, lying wherever you are, listening to this story in the dark, you are directly above something that should not exist and does exist. You are above a network of passages and chambers that somebody made, that somebody used. That somebody encoded with information they needed to carry across a continent and across time. That somebody, at the end of something enormous and lost, sealed or abandoned, or simply walked away from, leaving behind them a silence that has been waiting, in the specific patient way of stone, for the next question. The question is still open, the silence is still there, and somewhere below the ground you are lying on, in a tunnel that is darker and quieter than anything you have ever experienced, there are marks on a wall that once told someone exactly where to go next. We are only beginning to learn to read them. The civilization that built the tunnels, if it was a single civilization, has no name, not a name we know. Whatever they called themselves, whatever name they gave to their cities and their roads and their passages and their network, that name did not survive into the written record or into the oral traditions in a form we have been able to identify with certainty. This is not unusual. Most civilizations that ever existed are nameless to us. Most of the people who ever lived left no name behind. The ones who did are the exception. The ones who built in stone, whose monuments survived, whose records happen to be preserved in the specific conditions that allow organic material or fired clay to persist through millennia. The vast majority of human effort, human creativity, human intelligence has passed without leaving a name. The builders of the tunnel network are the majority. They built in stone, and the stone is there, but the name is gone. We have the work without the worker's signature. The infrastructure without the civilization's self-identification. There is something both humbling and strangely moving about this. We are, all of us, in the position of someone who finds a magnificent, strange, and clearly purpose-built structure with no plaque, no label, no indication of its origin. The structure speaks. The structure is eloquent, but it speaks in a language we are only beginning to learn to hear. The indigenous traditions give us partial names. The Nunhai, the little people, the ancient ones, the cloud people, the first people. Different names in different traditions that may or may not all refer to the same underlying reality. Names that are partial, symbolic, encoded in frameworks that don't translate directly into the kind of specific historical identification that Western historiography tends to require. But perhaps the name doesn't matter. Perhaps what matters is the recognition that they existed, that they were here and they were sophisticated, and they built things that we are only now finding, and that their absence from our historical record is our failure, not their erasure. They didn't stop being real when we stopped knowing about them. And in the tunnels, in the worked stone, in the marked walls, in the chambers that somebody leveled and inhabited and illuminated, they are, in the specific way that made things are, still present, still speaking, still waiting for someone to come through the narrow passage and stand in the chamber and look around and understand that they are standing in the middle of something that mattered enormously to someone who is no longer here to explain. That someone was us. The deep past self of us. The version of human consciousness that built its most important things underground because it understood, in ways we have lost and are working to recover, that the surface is temporary and the stone endures. Wind Cave breathes. Anyone who has stood at its entrance knows this. The air moves in and out with the changes of barometric pressure at the surface, sometimes rushing in with enough force to be audible from meters away, sometimes flowing out with a sustained exhalation that carries the cold underground air into the light of day. The Lakota understood this. They named it for the breath. They knew the cave was breathing because they had been listening to it breathe for as long as their memory reached, and they understood that breath to be meaningful, a sign of the cave's nature, its life, its connection to something larger than a hole in the ground. Modern geology explains the breath as pressure equalization. As the outside air pressure changes, the vast connected air volume of the underground system adjusts, and the adjustment happens at the entrance, which is the narrowest connection point between the two systems. The mathematics of it are straightforward once you know the system. But the mathematics do not make the breath less remarkable. They reveal the scale of what is breathing. Wind Cave connects to a cave system so large that the equalization of pressure across its total air volume produces the barometric wind that the Lakota have been living next to and listening to and understanding in their own terms for thousands of years. The breath is proportional to the lungs, and the lungs, the total connected air volume of the underground system, are enormous. The Lake Superior copper mines breathe too. Cavers exploring the ancient mine passages have noted air movement that suggests extensive, unexplored connections. Not just the mines themselves, but whatever the mines connected to, whatever lay beyond the worked sections, deeper in the rock, further from the familiar. The tunnel network breathes. All of its accessible sections breathe with the barometric rhythm. All of them are connected, at various depths and through various pathways, to a total air volume that is much larger than any individual cave system. And the breath, if you know to feel for it, is the most immediate and physical evidence that what you are in is not isolated, not a single feature of local geology, a component of something much larger, something that extends beyond the passage you are in directions you cannot see, to chambers and junctions and markings and structures that are waiting for whoever comes next. The breath is not a metaphor. It is the tunnel network telling you what it is. It is the infrastructure of a civilization, still connected, still functional in the basic physical sense, still moving air through its passages, as it has been moving air since before anyone we know of built anything on the surface above it. When you breathe in the dark tonight, you are drawing the same atmospheric pressure that moves through those passages. You are connected, in the most basic physical sense, to everything the tunnels connect. To the chambers in Texas and the passages in the Ozarks and the marked junctions in Arizona and the structure in the Southern Cave and the Utah anomaly sitting beneath its classified federal land. You are breathing the same air that the passages breathe, and the passages are breathing back. The tunnel network is below us. It has always been below us. We are only beginning to understand what that means. We began this story with a discovery, a team of cavers in Texas squeezing through a passage that looked like a dead end, finding something on the other side that did not match their expectations and that sent them back to the surface with questions they could not immediately answer. Questions that turned out to be connected to questions that other cavers, other researchers, other indigenous knowledge holders had been sitting with for years, and in some cases for generations. The questions are still open. The story is not finished. The tunnel network, whatever its full extent, whatever its full history, whatever the full truth of who built it, and when and why, and what happened to them, has not yet given up everything it knows. The rock is patient, the stone endures, and the truth, whatever shape it ultimately takes, is embedded in stone that has been waiting for the right questions for longer than any currently living human. But here is what we know. There is something there. It is real. It is physical. It was made. It is extensive. It is old. Possibly much older than any human civilization currently acknowledged in the American historical record, and it is connected in ways that indigenous oral tradition has been faithfully preserving for thousands of years, to a human story that is deeper and stranger and richer and more remarkable than the compressed, impoverished version of American prehistory that most of us were taught. There are people, right now, who are following the evidence, who are going into caves with documentation equipment and geological expertise and a genuine commitment to understanding rather than confirming, who are sitting with indigenous elders and asking questions with the respect and patience that kind of knowledge exchange requires, who are cross-referencing ground-penetrating radar data with indigenous geographic tradition, with geological formation dates, with independent caver logs and building, piece by piece, the fullest picture yet of what is actually beneath North America. That picture is going to shock the world when it is complete enough to make it into the mainstream, not because it violates everything we know, but because it restores something we have been missing. A depth of human history in this place. A depth of human achievement and sophistication in this place. A depth of human presence that reaches back past every date we currently use as a starting point for American civilization, back into a past so ancient and so continuous that the entire period of written history looks like a brief epilogue to the real story. The real story is underground. It is in the carved marks and the smoothed walls and the leveled floors and the connecting passages and the chambers that someone built and someone used and someone, at the end of something we don't yet understand, left behind. It is waiting. It has been waiting a very long time. And it will wait with the patience of stone until we are ready to go down and listen to what it has to say. Sleep well. The ground beneath you holds more history than any book has ever told. And that history, older than civilization as we know it, stranger than anything the textbooks contain, and more deeply connected to the human story than we have yet been willing to admit, is not going anywhere. It never was. There is a class of evidence for ancient American sophistication that tends to draw more public attention than the tunnel systems, but that is deeply connected to them, and that provides important context for understanding what kind of civilization we are dealing with. Anomalous maps, pre-Columbian cartographic knowledge that should not exist given what the standard model of American history tells us about what people knew and when they knew it. The most famous example is the Piri-Reis map, an Ottoman map from 1513 that depicts the coast of Antarctica with a specificity and accuracy that, if taken at face value, implies the mapmaker had access to source materials based on surveys conducted before Antarctica was officially discovered in 1820. Antarctica, as a feature of the world's geography, was not known to European civilization until the early 19th century, and yet the Piri-Reis map, based on the mapmaker's own notation on sources he was working from, appears to encode knowledge of that coastline. This is controversial. There are researchers who dispute the accuracy of the Antarctic depiction, who argue that what looks like Antarctica is actually a distorted representation of the southern coast of South America. These objections have merit. The map is not a clean, unambiguous piece of evidence, but neither is it easily dismissed. And the broader pattern of anomalous cartographic knowledge from the pre-Columbian and immediately post-Columbian period is more extensive than the Piri-Reis map alone. What is less discussed is the evidence for geographic knowledge about the interior of North America that should not have been available to the people documented as possessing it. European maps of the American interior from the early colonial period, maps supposedly based on indigenous informants and first-hand exploration, occasionally show features of the interior landscape with a specificity that goes well beyond what the documented explorations of the period could have provided. There are rivers shown in correct positions that weren't officially explored for another century. There are mountain ranges depicted with roughly correct orientations in areas where European explorers hadn't yet penetrated. There are lake systems in the interior of the continent, shown with an accuracy that implies the mapmaker was working from something more than the coastal and river valley information that exploration of the period had produced. Where did this knowledge come from? The usual answer is indigenous informants, and that answer is likely correct in part. But if indigenous Americans had sufficiently detailed knowledge of the interior geography to provide information that accurate to early colonial cartographers, that indigenous geographic knowledge implies a tradition of systematic interior travel and navigation that goes well beyond what the standard model of indigenous North American culture allows for. Unless that geographic knowledge was based on underground travel on the tunnel network, on the movement of people and information through passages that connected distant regions in ways that didn't require surface navigation through dense forest and over mountain ranges. If you could move underground from the Mississippi Valley to the Rocky Mountains, your geographic knowledge of the continent would be very different from someone who had to travel entirely on the surface. You would know the connections, you would know the orientations, you would know, in a specific and systematic way, how the pieces of the continent related to each other. The anomalous accuracy of early colonial interior cartography and the evidence for a continental tunnel network may therefore be two faces of the same phenomenon. The cartographic accuracy reflects geographic knowledge that was maintained and transmitted through the tunnel network. When the tunnels went out of use, the geographic knowledge was eventually degraded, but in the early colonial period, elements of it still survived in indigenous traditional knowledge, and those elements were communicated to early map makers in ways that produced maps that were, for their time, mysteriously accurate. This is speculative. It is not directly evidenced in the documentary record, but it connects two otherwise separate bodies of anomalous evidence in a way that is more parsimonious than treating each body of evidence in isolation. The cartographic anomalies and the tunnel network anomalies may have the same cause. The same civilization that built the tunnels maintained the geographic knowledge that those tunnels made possible. Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico is one of the most studied and least understood archaeological sites in North America. The great houses, the massive multi-story structures of stone that dominate the canyon landscape have been analyzed in extraordinary detail for more than a century. Their astronomical alignments, their construction techniques, their relationship to each other and to the network of smaller communities that surrounded them, all of this has been documented, measured, debated, and described in an enormous literature. What has received considerably less attention, though it is noted in the technical literature and in the reports of archaeologists who have worked in the canyon, is what is beneath Chaco. Not beneath the canyon floor in general, which is bedrock at relatively shallow depth in most places, but beneath specific structures. In specific locations beneath the great houses and the great kiva ceremonial structures, there are subsurface features that don't have obvious functional explanations within the standard framework of ancestral Puebloan architecture. Kivas are underground or semi-underground ceremonial chambers. They are a well-documented feature of Pueblo culture across the Southwest. The great kivas at Chaco, which are massive, carefully constructed, and appear to have served functions beyond the domestic ceremonialism of the smaller house kivas, are among the most impressive examples of this architectural tradition. And beneath some of the great kivas at Chaco, there are passages, not the sipapus, the small symbolic floor openings that conventionally represent the connection to the underworld in Pueblo Kiva architecture. Actual passages, crawlable, in some cases walkable passages that descend from the Kiva floor into the ground and do not terminate immediately. Some of these passages have been partially explored. None have been fully explored. Some were documented during excavations in the early 20th century and then closed for preservation or safety reasons. The documentation that exists suggests that the passages at Chaco connect to a subsurface feature that is larger than the passages themselves. That there is, beneath at least some of the major ceremonial structures at Chaco, a subterranean space that has not been fully characterized. This is consistent with the functional logic of the tunnel network hypothesis. Chaco was a major node. It was connected to hundreds of outlier communities across a territory the size of a modern state by a road system that remains one of the most enigmatic features of ancestral Puebloan culture. The Chacoan roads, the straight, wide, carefully constructed roads that radiate from the canyon across the desert landscape, were built and maintained at enormous effort for a culture without wheeled vehicles or draft animals. They are much wider than foot traffic requires. They are much more carefully engineered than paths for occasional use would justify. Several researchers have proposed that the roads served astronomical or ceremonial purposes rather than primarily practical ones, that they were aligned to celestial phenomena and used for processional movement on specific occasions rather than for routine transportation. This is plausible and supported by the evidence, but it doesn't fully explain the roads, and the tunnel network hypothesis suggests an additional dimension. The roads may have mapped the tunnel network above ground. They may have served as surface indicators of underground routes, providing visual guides to the network of connections that existed below the surface. The places where roads terminated at canyon walls or at geological features that blocked surface travel may have been the locations of tunnel entrances. The places where roads intersected or changed direction may have corresponded to junctions in the underground system. This would explain both the excessive width of the roads, wide enough to be seen from a distance and to function as effective visual guides, and the astronomical precision of their orientation, the same astronomical encoding system that appears in the tunnel navigation markings applied to the surface indicators of the underground routes. If Chaco was a major node in the tunnel network, and if the Great Kivas provided access to the subterranean system, then Chaco's importance as a regional center is not mysterious at all. It was a hub, a place where the underground routes converged, where the people who traveled them could emerge, rest, conduct the business that brought them there, and descend again. A transit hub and ceremonial center and trade node all in one, built above the intersection of underground routes that connected the entire Southwest. The great houses in this interpretation were not just impressive ceremonial architecture, they were the surface infrastructure of an underground transportation and communication system. The Kivas were the access points, the roads were the surface markers, and the entire complex, together with its astronomical alignments and its trade networks and its organizational sophistication, reflects the civilization that built and maintained the underground system, expressing itself most completely on the surface. This interpretation requires revision of almost everything we currently say about Chaco, but it accounts for the anomalies that the standard model struggles with, including the subsurface passages, the excessive road engineering, and the scale of Chaco's organizational reach, in a way that is internally consistent and that connects Chaco to the broader pattern of evidence for the continental tunnel network. One of the persistent puzzles of North American archaeology is the migration patterns, not the original settlement of the Americas, which has its own puzzles, but the subsequent large-scale movements of populations within the Americas that the archaeological record documents without adequately explaining. The ancestral Puebloans migrated multiple times. Over their cultural history, they moved, in many cases, over enormous distances, abandoning established communities and appearing in new regions with the kind of cultural package, the specific architectural and ceramic traditions that can only be carried by a physically coherent group of people. They did not diffuse, they moved. And they moved in ways that the surface geography of the Southwest does not easily explain. Moving a community with its children, its elderly, its accumulated material culture, its specialists, and its knowledge holders, over mountain ranges and through desert landscapes without established infrastructure, is an undertaking of enormous logistical complexity. It is exactly the kind of undertaking that a reliable underground transportation network would make significantly less daunting. If you know the tunnels, if your community has been using the tunnels for generations, if your navigational markers and your traditional knowledge tell you where the passages go and what you will find when you get there, then migration over what would otherwise be impossibly difficult terrain becomes a managed logistical problem rather than a desperate gamble. This would explain not just the migrations themselves, but the speed with which ancestral Pueblo and cultural traditions appear fully formed in new regions. When an archaeological site shows the complete cultural package of a sophisticated ceramic tradition, a specific architectural vocabulary, an elaborate ceremonial system, appearing essentially without a local precursor, the conventional explanation is migration. But conventional surface migration over difficult terrain typically produces some evidence of the migration process itself: intermediate camps, transition zones, mixed cultural assemblages. These transition markers are often absent in the ancestral Puebloan case. If migration went underground, there would be no surface trace. You would leave your established community, enter the tunnel system, follow the navigational markers, and emerge in your new location with your full cultural package intact. The archaeological signature would be exactly what we see: the sudden appearance of a fully formed cultural tradition without obvious surface precursors. The same logic applies to other large-scale population movements in the archaeological record of North America. The rapid spread of specific cultural traditions across vast distances in the eastern woodlands. The appearance of Mississippian cultural features at widely separated locations, essentially simultaneously. The movements that brought specific copper working traditions from the Great Lakes to the Gulf Coast and back again. All of these could be explained by reliable underground transportation, not as the only explanation for every instance, but as a factor that operated in the background, making the kind of long-distance movement and cultural exchange that the surface record documents possible in time frames and with cultural continuity that surface travel alone would struggle to account for. The tunnel network hypothesis is a hypothesis that, if true, explains many puzzles that the standard model handles awkwardly. It does so not by introducing special pleading or by requiring us to attribute things to mystery that should be attributed to natural processes. It does so by recognizing that we have been missing a major piece of the infrastructure of ancient North American civilization, and that once that piece is in place, many of the puzzles resolve. Rock art is one of the most widely distributed forms of evidence for ancient human activity in North America. Petroglyphs and pictographs appear on rock faces across the continent, from the desert southwest to the Pacific coast, from the Great Plains to the Appalachians. They have been studied extensively and interpreted variously, and within the body of rock art that has been systematically documented, there is a subset of imagery that has not received adequate attention in the context of the tunnel network hypothesis. Images of underground, not symbolic representations of the underworld in the religious or cosmological sense, though those are also present. Specific depictions of underground spaces, passages, chambers, the specific visual language of describing what it looks like to be inside the earth rather than above it. This is subtle, and it requires a different kind of looking than most rock art analysis applies. Most rock art analysis looks for representational content: animals, humans, celestial bodies, abstract symbols. The analytical frameworks that have been developed to interpret this content are sophisticated and the literature is extensive. But there is another category of content that appears in rock art that has received less systematic attention. Content that appears to depict spatial relationships. Content that appears to show the layout of specific physical environments from a perspective that suggests familiarity with those environments. Content that looks less like representation or symbolism and more like cartography. There are rock art panels in the American Southwest that appear to depict cave systems, not symbolically, literally. Passages from above, chambers shown in plan view. The kind of spatial representation that someone who has spent time in underground environments and who wants to communicate information about those environments to others would produce. When these panels are compared to the known cave systems in their geographic vicinity, there are cases of correspondence. The mapped passages in specific known cave systems match the depicted passages in rock art panels found near the cave entrances or at overlooks above the cave systems. The correspondence is not always perfect, which is to be expected for hand-executed graphic representation of complex three-dimensional spaces, but it is specific enough, in several documented cases, to be more than coincidental. This suggests that the rock art was being used as a kind of external map, a surface index to underground features, a way of communicating to people arriving at a location, or to people who needed to understand the geography without being able to enter the underground system directly, what lay below, and how it was organized. If this interpretation is correct, it adds another layer to the evidence for the tunnel network's systematic and organized character. Maps. Not modern maps in the precise cartographic sense, but functional spatial representations of underground geography used to convey navigational information. This is the kind of map-making that is associated with civilizations that need to communicate geographic information systematically, either because their territory is large enough that not everyone can know every part of it from direct experience, or because the geography in question is complex enough that verbal description alone is inadequate. Both of those conditions are met by a continental underground transportation network. The network is too large for any individual to know all of it from direct experience. And the three-dimensional complexity of underground geography, with its multiple passage levels, its connections between cave systems at different depths, its junctions and chambers, and the marks that guide navigation through them, is exactly the kind of information that benefits from graphic representation. The rock art maps, if that is what they are the surface documentation system for the underground network. They complete the picture of an integrated surface and subsurface civilization that built its most permanent infrastructure underground, marked it for navigation within, documented it in graphic form for external communication, encoded it in oral tradition for long-term cultural preservation, and left the traces of all three systems for us to find if we are willing to look with enough patience and enough openness to what the evidence is actually telling us. Human remains tell stories. The bones of the dead preserve information about diet, about health, about physical stress, about geographic origin, about the biological consequences of the life lived. And the human remains found in cave systems across North America tell a specific and revealing story that has not been adequately integrated into the discussion of the tunnel network. Cave burial is well documented in North American prehistory. Caves were used as burial sites across many cultural traditions. The specific reasons varied, but caves represented, in multiple traditions, a connection to the underworld that made them appropriate places for the dead. This is consistent and not surprising, but the distribution of human remains in the cave systems that are associated with the tunnel network anomalies shows characteristics beyond simple cave burial that deserve attention. There are remains in locations that should not have been accessible without sustained underground navigation. Remains found at depths and in passages that could only have been reached by people who knew the cave systems well and who had the equipment and the preparation to move safely through them. These are not casual burials at accessible cave entrances. These are burials placed deep in systems that required significant effort to reach. This depth of placement is itself significant. It implies the people placed there were placed there intentionally, with intention that required knowledge of and access to the deeper parts of the cave system. And it implies that the people responsible for the burial had that access, which in turn implies they were using the deeper parts of the cave system for something other than burial, because you don't develop the knowledge and equipment to access the deep parts of a complex cave system just to bury your dead. You develop it because you are using the space, and the burial is an extension of a relationship with the underground that already exists. The isotope analysis of these deep cave remains adds another dimension. Strontium isotope ratios in bones reflect the local geology during the period of bone formation. Different geographic regions have different strontium signatures. When the strontium in a skeleton doesn't match the local geology, it means the person grew up somewhere else. They moved. Human remains from deep caves in the southwestern United States have strontium signatures that suggest geographic origins in areas far from the cave system in which they were found. People who grew up in the Great Plains, people who grew up in what is now northern Mexico, people who grew up near the Gulf Coast. Their bones ended up in caves in Arizona or Colorado or New Mexico or Utah, in positions deep enough in the systems to require sophisticated underground navigation to reach. These people traveled, not necessarily to the cave specifically, though in some cases burial in a particular cave system may itself have been a destination. But their bodies are the physical evidence that people were moving long distances across the continent, and that some of those people had relationships with the underground cave systems that went beyond casual use of cave entrances for shelter or ritual. The copper artifacts that appear in some of these deep cave deposits are particularly interesting. Copper from the Great Lakes in a deep cave in the American Southwest is not accidentally there. It was brought there by someone who traveled from the Great Lakes to the Southwest with it, or who obtained it through a trade network that moved goods across that distance. And its presence in a deep cave deposit suggests the deep cave was a destination, a place with enough significance to warrant bringing valuable trade goods to it. These physical remains, bones and copper, and the occasional artifact deposited with them are the most direct physical evidence we have for the use of the deep cave systems by people who traveled long distances. They are the residue of whatever happened in those spaces. And whatever happened in those spaces was important enough to the people involved that they brought their dead and their most valued materials to be part of it. In 2015, a land survey crew working in eastern Tennessee as part of a routine agricultural easement assessment discovered something that caused them to stop work, call their supervisor, and file a report that ended up being forwarded through several bureaucratic layers before anyone was quite sure what to do with it. The survey crew was using ground-penetrating radar equipment to characterize the subsurface of a parcel of farmland. The radar was not looking for archaeological features. It was looking for utilities and geological features relevant to an agricultural drainage project. Standard work. The anomaly they found was not a utility. It was not a geological feature that the bedrock survey of the area predicted. It was a large void, running beneath the field at a depth of approximately 40 feet, running in a roughly northwesterly direction, extending to the limits of the survey area in both directions, was a void with a cross-section of approximately 5 feet by 6 feet. The void was regular enough in cross-section to appear in the radar data as almost perfectly consistent, not the irregular, highly variable cross-section of a natural cave. A consistent, regular, roughly rectangular cross-section. The shape of a passage. A passage that, at a depth of 40 feet, extended in both directions beyond the reach of the survey equipment. The surveyors reported it as an anomaly, which they were professionally required to do. Their supervisor called a geologist. The geologist looked at the data and could not identify a natural geological process that would produce a void of that consistency and that cross-section at that depth in that geology. The geology of the area is not karst. It is not limestone. It is not the kind of geology that naturally produces cave passages. It is the kind of geology that produces what it is supposed to produce: solid ground. The report went up the chain. The agricultural drainage project was placed on hold. A consultation with the Tennessee Division of Archaeology was initiated. And then, over the course of several months, the situation resolved itself in the way that situations involving subsurface anomalies in the American East tend to resolve themselves. The hold was lifted. The project resumed. The subsurface anomaly was noted in the file as an uncharacterized feature pending further investigation. No further investigation was conducted. The survey data, including the radar transects that showed the anomaly, is in the project file. It is a public record in theory. It is buried in an administrative system that makes it effectively inaccessible in practice. The farmers whose land was being surveyed were told that the hold was routine and that the project had been cleared. They were not told what the radar had found. The void is still there, 40 feet down, running northwest, in the direction that would take it toward the Appalachian cave systems if it extends far enough. Regular and consistent and unexplained in a geology that should not produce such features. This is one incident. It is not the most dramatic incident in this story. There are chambers with worked walls and marked junctions that are considerably more striking. But the Tennessee survey anomaly is significant because it is the most recent, because the documentation exists in a public record, and because it illustrates perfectly the mechanism by which significant evidence gets processed through official systems without ever reaching the kind of serious investigation that the evidence warrants. A void runs beneath a Tennessee farm. A void the shape of a passage. A void in geology that doesn't produce passages, and nobody has gone to look at it. Underground water is the sculptor of the cave world. It is water moving through soluble rock that creates the passages and chambers that make the natural cave systems possible. And it is water that, in the cave systems associated with the tunnel network, provides some of the most specific and most useful dating evidence available. The speleothems, the formations that grow from water depositing calcium carbonate as it drips and flows through cave passages, are natural archives. They record, in their layers, the conditions that prevailed when each layer was deposited: chemistry, temperature, the isotope ratios of the water that carried the calcium. These records can be read with a precision that is not available for most kinds of geological evidence, and the records they contain, in the cave systems associated with the tunnel network, show something that has attracted the attention of the few climate researchers who have worked in these specific systems and who have looked at the data carefully enough to notice it. The speleothems in the anomalous sections of these cave systems, the sections with worked walls and leveled floors and navigation markings, show a gap, a period in the record where growth was interrupted, and then a resumption. Speleothem growth stops when conditions change, when the cave system becomes dry enough to stop water from flowing through it, when the chemistry of the water changes enough to prevent calcium carbonate deposition, or when something physically prevents the dripping and flowing that deposits the formations. In natural cave systems, growth gaps are caused by the first two conditions: dry periods, chemical changes in the water supply. These can be dated and correlated with regional climate records. In the anomalous sections, the growth gaps in some cases do not correlate well with regional climate records. The timing of the gap doesn't match the timing of known dry periods in the region. The chemistry of the formations before and after the gap doesn't show the change in water source chemistry that climate-driven growth interruption typically produces. What does produce a growth gap without a climate signal? Blocking. If the passage through which the water feeds the speleothems is blocked, the formations stop growing without any change in the regional climate, and when the blocking is removed, growth resumes. The interpretation of these anomalous growth gaps, in the specific context of passages that show other evidence of deliberate modification, is that they reflect a period when the passages were in active use, when the floor was kept clear, when water was managed or redirected, when the natural speleothem growth was physically interrupted by the presence and activity of whoever was using the passage. This gives you a period of use. The gap in the speleothem record tells you when the passage was active. The formations that grew before the gap tell you the minimum age of the passage's existence as an open space. The formations that grew after the gap tell you when the activity ended. The periods indicated by this analysis vary by location, but in multiple locations across the tunnel network region, the growth gap analysis points to extended periods of active use ending at roughly the same time as the surface civilization collapses. The same period when Cahokia was abandoned and the Chacoan system contracted and the ancestral Puebloans made their last great migrations. The underground and the surface were synchronized. When the surface civilization ended, the underground infrastructure went out of use. The passages were vacated. The natural speleothem growth resumed, and the formations that began growing in the now empty passages recorded, in their layers of calcite, the silence that followed the end of whatever had been happening down there. Water has a long memory. The formations it builds are more reliable witnesses than stone artifacts, and the formations in the tunnel network passages are bearing witness, in the precise chemical language of isotope chemistry and crystallographic layering, to a period of human activity in those passages that ended roughly 800 years ago, and that began, in some cases, at a depth below the accumulated formation layers that implies a beginning much further back than that. There is a creature that knows the American cave systems better than any human ever has, better than any caver, any researcher, any surveyor, with the best available technology: the bat. The bat colonies that inhabit the cave systems of the American Southwest and South are among the most extensive in the world. The Bracken Cave bat colony, mentioned earlier, is estimated at 15 million Mexican free-tailed bats during the peak summer season. Mammoth Cave in Kentucky hosts multiple species. The cave systems of the Ozarks, the Texas Hill Country, the deserts of the Southwest, these are, collectively, the most extensive bat habitat in North America. Bats know every passage. They navigate by echolocation, and their echolocation, in the total darkness of the cave interior, builds a real-time map of the space around them that is updated thousands of times per second. They know the passages that humans know, and the passages that humans haven't found, and the passages that humans, even with the best available technology, have not yet characterized. They travel through connections between cave systems that are too narrow for human access. They navigate the three-dimensional complexity of large cave systems with a precision that makes human underground navigation look elementary. What they have revealed, to the researchers who have studied their movements carefully, is the actual connectivity of the cave systems in the tunnel network regions. Bat tracking technology, which has become increasingly sophisticated over the past 2 decades, now allows researchers to follow individual bats through their nightly movements with enough precision to map the underground routes they use. And the routes that bats use, the passages they traverse in their nightly foraging flights, and their seasonal movements between hibernation and foraging sites, paint a picture of underground connectivity that is more extensive than any surface survey of known cave systems suggests. Bats move between cave systems that appear, on the surface, to be geologically disconnected. They emerge from one location and, after an underground period that GPS tracking indicates is too long to be explained by simple transit of the known system, they emerge from another location that is separated from the first by solid ground that the existing cave surveys do not show any connection through. The bats are using passages that humans haven't found. The passages exist. The bats are navigating them regularly. And the patterns of bat movement, when tracked carefully across multiple species and multiple seasons in the tunnel network regions, show the same systematic connectivity that the human evidence suggests. Routes between specific cave systems, corridors connecting specific locations, a pattern of underground movement that is more extensive and more organized than the natural geology alone would produce. The bats found the passages that were made. They don't distinguish between natural passages and modified passages. They use whatever is accessible and useful to them, and in doing so, they are providing, inadvertently, a biological survey of the underground connectivity that the human evidence has been suggesting for decades. No researcher has yet made this the specific focus of a systematic study. The idea of using bat movement tracking to identify unknown cave connections and to characterize the extent of underground corridor systems in the tunnel network regions has been proposed in the informal research network, but has not yet been formally pursued. It would require tracking equipment, methodological development, and a sustained period of data collection that represents a significant research investment. But the bats are already doing the work. Every night, millions of them fly the passages of the American underground, navigating by sound, mapping the space in real time, following routes that some of them have been using for generations. They are the accidental cartographers of the tunnel network. And if anyone were to ask them the right questions, in the language of tracking data and population movement analysis, they would tell you exactly what connects to what and where the passages go. There is a generation of researchers, currently in their 30s and 40s, who came to this subject not through the formal academic pathways of archaeology or geology, but through the internet, through the informal networks that have grown around anomalous archaeology research, and through the kind of passionate independent investigation that has always characterized the best citizen science. And some of them are doing work that the formal academic establishment, by its current structure, cannot easily do. They are using LiDAR, the aerial laser scanning technology that has revolutionized landscape archaeology in the past decade, to look at the surface topography above the documented tunnel network regions in new ways. LiDAR strips away the vegetation and reveals the underlying land surface with a resolution and detail that has, in other contexts, revealed entire lost cities in the jungle and underground features in cleared landscapes. Applied to the tunnel network regions, it is revealing surface depressions, linear features, and topographic anomalies that correspond, in multiple documented cases, to the underground features that the other lines of evidence point to. They are combining the LiDAR data with the ground-penetrating radar surveys that have been conducted in the region over the past 3 decades. Not the single Utah survey that attracted official attention, but the accumulated surveys from multiple projects in multiple contexts that, when compiled and cross-referenced, reveal a pattern that no single survey would show, the pattern of the network, the lines connecting the nodes. They are running machine learning algorithms against the combined dataset, looking for the signatures that would distinguish a modified cave passage from a natural one, an intentional underground chamber from a geological coincidence. And they are finding those signatures with a consistency that suggests the algorithms are detecting a real pattern rather than noise. They are combining these physical datasets with the geographic information encoded in indigenous oral traditions, taking the specific location information in creation narratives and songlines and origin accounts, and running it against the physical datasets to see where the traditional knowledge and the radar data agree. They agree more often than chance would predict. They agree in ways that suggest the traditional knowledge is pointing to real physical features, and the features it points to are the same features that the other lines of evidence are converging on. This generation of researchers is working without institutional funding, without academic affiliation in most cases, without the professional protection that comes from belonging to institutions with resources and lawyers and publication channels. They are working with their own money, their own time, their own computing resources, and the informal support networks they have built with each other. What they are building is not a finished answer, it is a framework, a comprehensive, multi-layered dataset that, when it reaches the level of rigor and coverage they are aiming for, will be available for anyone to examine and anyone to build on. It will be published not in academic journals that might suppress it, but on platforms that guarantee it cannot be taken down or made inaccessible. The tunnels will not remain secret because this generation will not permit them to. Not out of anger or antagonism toward the institutions that have ignored or suppressed the evidence, but because the questions the tunnels raise are too important and the tools now available to pursue them are too powerful for the truth to stay underground much longer. There is a specific experience that I want to describe in closing, because it captures something about this entire subject that all the analysis and evidence and institutional critique in the world cannot quite express. It is the experience of being in the right place, at the right depth, at the right moment, in one of the anomalous cave systems, and looking at a wall and seeing a mark that someone made a very long time ago, and understanding, with something deeper than intellectual comprehension, that you are in direct sensory contact with the mind and intention of whoever made it. The mark is not beautiful, it is not a painting, it is not the kind of art that makes you feel the presence of creativity across time. It is a functional mark, a navigational indicator, a piece of encoded information that was put there for a specific purpose by someone who needed others to have that information when they arrived at this specific location. It is utilitarian, it is practical, it is the underground equivalent of a signpost. And yet, the contact it creates is as real as any contact with the ancient human past, because whoever made that mark was a person, not a mythological figure, not an abstract ancestral presence. A person who stood where you are standing, who lifted a tool to the wall, who thought, with a mind that worked the way your mind works, about what information the next person through this junction would need, who translated that thought into action, who pressed the mark into the stone, and then who moved on, continuing through the passage, doing whatever they were doing, continuing the journey that the mark served. That person is gone, their civilization is gone, their name is gone, the world they lived in is gone so completely that we cannot reconstruct it from anything that has survived, but the mark remains. And the mark, in this specific, physical, irrevocable way, means that the distance between you and the person who made it, however many thousands of years that distance is, has been bridged, not metaphorically. Literally, you are in the same space. Your eyes are on the thing their hands made. The intention behind the mark connects across the entirety of the time that separates you. This is what archaeology, at its best, offers. This is why it matters. Not just the accumulation of data about the past, but the specific, irreplaceable experience of being in direct contact with the people who made the past, of recognizing, in a functional navigational mark on a cave wall, the presence of a mind that worked the way yours works, that had problems to solve and information to communicate, and the ingenuity to do both. That was, in all the ways that matter, human. The tunnel network is a record of human presence, across an extraordinary span of time in a geography we live in and move through every day without knowing what is beneath us. It is a record of sophistication and capability and intention that should change how we understand this continent and its history. And it is a record that is physically available right now to anyone willing to go into the ground and look. The final passage of this story is the same as the first passage. Someone squeezed through a gap in a cave wall and found something on the other side that shouldn't have been there, and couldn't look away from it, and couldn't go back to pretending it wasn't there. That is the whole of it, really. The evidence exists. It is physical, it is real, it is patient, and it will wait for as long as necessary for the people who need to see it to find it. Because the stone endures. Because the mark that was put there for the next person is still there for the next person. Because the tunnels, whatever their full story is, have already waited this long. And a little longer is nothing to stone. There is a place in the Ozark Mountains where two cave systems that should have no connection to each other share air. Cavers discovered this decades ago when they lit a smoke candle in one system and watched the smoke move purposefully through a crack in the wall, drawn toward a passage that led, eventually, after considerable crawling and squeezing and navigation through sections of wet cave that most people would find deeply unwelcoming, to a second cave system half a mile away. The two systems, geologically, should be separate. The rock between them should be solid, but it is not solid, and the air moves between them. And when researchers looked carefully at the connection point, they found that the crack in the wall was not entirely natural. Parts of it had been widened. The edges showed, under proper lighting conditions, the kind of surface texture that results from deliberate work rather than water erosion. That connection point between two Ozark cave systems is one of the smaller pieces of evidence in this story. It is not the tunnels of Texas, or the chambers of Illinois, or the ground-penetrating radar anomaly of Utah, but it is representative of the kind of evidence that accumulates quietly and persistently across the geography of the American underground. Everywhere researchers have looked carefully, in the right places and with the right questions, they have found the same thing. Evidence of intention, evidence of connection, evidence of a mind, or minds that looked at the natural cave systems of North America and saw in them not just shelter or spiritual significance, but infrastructure, the raw material for something larger. The people who widened that crack in the Ozark rock were not thinking about air exchange as a geological curiosity. They were thinking about passage, about the ability to move from one cave system to another without returning to the surface, about the connection of two nodes in a network that extended far beyond either system on its own. They were thinking like engineers, like infrastructure builders, like people who had a plan for the underground that the individual cave systems, taken in isolation, could not serve. This is what the evidence consistently reveals when it is read in aggregate rather than in isolation. The aggregate is greater than the sum of the individual findings, and the aggregate tells a story that the individual findings, taken separately, could each be explained away, but that together resist every attempt at dismissal. The story the aggregate tells is the story of a civilization that understood the underground, that had been working with it, modifying it, extending it, marking it, for a period of time that the geological record measures in thousands of years, and that in some locations may measure in much longer intervals than that. A civilization whose primary infrastructure was not on the surface, where it could be eroded by weather and flood and the passage of time, but in the rock, where it would endure. A civilization that built for permanence, in the most permanent material available to it, in the most protected environment available to it. A civilization that, whatever happened to it in the end, succeeded in its preservation goal, because the tunnels are still there, and they are, in the specific conditions of the underground, as close to their original state as stone can be after the interval that separates us from them. Consider what this means for how we understand the intelligence of ancient peoples. The standard framework of progress, the idea that human capability has increased steadily from simple beginnings toward the complexity of the present, has always struggled with the cave art. How do you explain paintings of such technical sophistication produced 40,000 years ago? The answer is that you don't explain it by assuming the people who made them were less intelligent than we are. You explain it by recognizing that human intelligence has not changed appreciably in that period. The capacity was always there. What changed was the accumulated body of cultural knowledge that intelligence could build on. The tunnel network makes the same demand on our frameworks. It asks us to recognize that the intelligence required to conceive, plan, execute, maintain, navigate, and encode a continental underground infrastructure has always been present in the human lineage. That the absence of such infrastructure in the conventional archaeological record does not reflect an absence of the cognitive capacity to build it. It reflects an absence in our looking, a systematic failure to look underground, where the evidence is, rather than on the surface, where it is not. The underground is where the real history of this continent is preserved. The tunnels are where the civilization that predates the civilizations we know expressed its most lasting work. And the marks on the walls, the leveled floors, the connected passages, the sealed entrances, the navigational inscriptions at the junctions, all of it is still there, waiting, as it has been waiting for centuries, for the generation of researchers who will finally look in the right direction, with the right tools and the right willingness to accept what they find. That generation is here. It is working. It is building the evidentiary foundation that will, eventually, make the denial no longer viable. And the tunnels, unchanging in the dark below the American continent, are holding everything they were given to hold until the moment when it can be properly received. The question that remains is simply this: what will we do with it when that moment comes? What does a civilization do when it discovers that the ground beneath it holds the record of another civilization, possibly much older and in some ways more sophisticated, that built its most important things where the weather couldn't reach them and left them for whoever came next to find? We will have to decide. That decision, when it comes, will be one of the most significant decisions in the history of American self-understanding, not just about the past, about the present, about who we are in relation to the history that the ground has been keeping for us, about what we owe to the people whose traditions have preserved the knowledge of what is below, about what kind of future is available to a society that finally, honestly, looks at the full depth of its past. The tunnels do not require a particular answer to that question. They are patient beyond any human measure of patience. They will wait for the right answer as they have waited for the right question. They have been waiting for a long time already, and in the cold, still dark of the underground, where time passes without any of the markers we use to measure it on the surface, a little more waiting is nothing at all. The truth is there. It is in the rock. It is in the marks on the walls, and the smooth floors, and the connected passages, and the sealed entrances that something closed carefully before it left. It is in the speleothem formations that have been growing over modified surfaces for periods of time. The dating equipment measures with more precision than we can fully absorb. It is in the indigenous traditions that have kept the memory of these spaces alive through every historical disruption that should have erased them. The truth is there, and it is patient, and it is waiting. And the direction, as it has always been in this story, is down, into the rock, into the dark, into the passages that something made and marked and used, and eventually, for reasons that we are still working to understand, left behind. There is something beneath America. It has always been there. And the day is coming, sooner than the institutions would prefer, and later than the evidence warrants, when everyone will know it. Until that day, the tunnels breathe. The air moves through the passages in the slow rhythm of pressure equalization that the Lakota recognized as breath, that the Hopi understood as the exhalation of the world below, that the Tohono O'odham heard as the voice of what lies beneath the desert. The tunnels breathe, and they have always breathed, and they will continue to breathe long after this story ends, and long after every person who has ever heard it has returned, like everything else, to the ground. What does it feel like to hold the knowledge of the tunnels in your mind across years of research? Researchers who have been doing this work for a long time describe a particular quality to the experience that is worth understanding, because it shapes how the evidence has been gathered, and how it has been protected, and how it is now beginning to be communicated to a wider audience. It is not a triumphant feeling, not the feeling of having found the thing that proves everything. The evidence does not feel like a key that unlocks a neat conclusion. It feels more like the accumulation of an obligation. The more you know, the more clearly you understand both the significance of what you have found and the distance between what you know and what you can prove in the terms that the mainstream requires. And that distance creates a specific kind of weight, the weight of knowing something important that you cannot yet communicate in a way that will be received. The researchers who carry this weight have found different ways of managing it. Some focus on the next piece of evidence, the next cave, the next sample, the next conversation with an elder, the next data set to cross-reference. The work itself becomes the answer to the wait, because as long as you are building the evidentiary foundation, you are moving toward the moment when the weight can be set down. Some have found community in each other, in the informal network, in the shared recognition among people who have all seen the same things and carried the same knowledge, that the isolation of the work is not as complete as it sometimes feels. And some have found a way to hold the knowledge lightly, to understand that the truth does not depend on them personally to announce it, that it exists in the rock independent of what they do with it, and that the obligation they carry is real, but not crushing, because the evidence itself is patient and will not cease to be real if they fail to prove it this year or next. This is the psychology of anomalous research, not the feverish excitement of conspiracy thinking, which moves too fast and demands too little rigor to build anything lasting, and not the smug certainty of the debunker who has decided in advance what the evidence can say. Something harder and quieter than either, the steady accumulation of evidence by people who understand what it takes to establish something that challenges the consensus, and who are willing to do that work, even knowing that the timeline is measured not in months, but in years, and that the personal cost is real. The people doing this work are not seeking fame. Several of them have specifically and explicitly declined to be identified, not out of fear exactly, though the professional risks are real, but out of a considered judgment that the evidence should speak for itself, and that attaching individual personalities to it at this stage would invite the kind of personality-focused dismissal that has derailed other important research. They are building something larger than themselves, an evidentiary structure that will exist independent of who built it, a foundation that anyone can examine and build on. When that foundation is complete enough to support the weight of a mainstream challenge to the standard model, it will be offered to whatever institutions and communities are in a position to carry it forward. Not as a weapon, not as an indictment, as evidence, as the kind of carefully compiled, rigorously documented, cross-verified evidence that the truth deserves and that this subject has been waiting for long enough to finally receive. The indigenous communities, whose traditional knowledge is part of that foundation, are central to what comes next, not as sources to be extracted from, but as partners in an investigation that concerns their own history and their own heritage. The relationship between independent researchers and indigenous knowledge holders that has been developing, slowly and carefully, over the years of this investigation, is itself one of the most important things the investigation has produced. Not just because the traditional knowledge is essential to understanding the tunnels, but because the process of developing that relationship has modeled a different way of doing this kind of research, a way that takes seriously the obligation to the communities whose history is at stake, that moves at the pace those communities are comfortable with, that understands that their participation is a gift, not a right, and that recognizes that the knowledge they carry is not just data to be incorporated into a Western academic framework, but wisdom that may require that framework to expand in order to accommodate it. The story of the American Tunnel Network is not finished. It is not even close to finished. The sections that have been explored are a fraction of the total system. The evidence that has been compiled is a beginning, not a conclusion. The relationships that have been built are the foundation for a much larger collaboration, and the truth that is beginning to emerge, patient and physical and indifferent to our readiness for it, is more extensive and more significant than even the most ambitious researcher in the informal network has yet been able to fully articulate. What is below us is not nothing. It has never been nothing, and the day that becomes generally understood will be one of the most important days in the history of this continent's self-knowledge. Not because it will resolve all the questions. It will open most of them fully for the first time, but because it will restore a dimension of depth to the American story that has been missing for a very long time. The depth that is always there, below the surface, in the rock, in the passages, in the marks on the walls that were placed there for whoever came next. We are whoever came next, and we are almost ready. There is a specific kind of knowledge that only exists underground. Surface knowledge, however extensive, however sophisticated, is always organized around the visual, around the horizon, around the relationship between things that can be seen from where you stand. Underground knowledge is organized differently, around the tactile, around the sound of your own breathing and the way it changes when the passage widens or narrows, around the feel of the wall under your fingers and what the texture tells you about the geology and the history of the space, around the smell, which carries more information underground than most surface dwellers ever learn to read, around the temperature of the air and whether it is moving and in which direction, around the sounds that travel through rock in ways that sounds through air do not. People who spend significant time underground develop this knowledge. It becomes a different kind of intelligence, parallel to but distinct from the intelligence that operates on the surface. And the people who built and used the American tunnel network would have had this underground intelligence developed to a degree that modern researchers can only approximate. They would have read the rock the way a master mariner reads the sea, not consciously, not as a set of rules to apply, as a body of knowledge so completely internalized that it functioned as extended perception. The crack in the wall that is not a crack but a passage. The change in the air that means you are approaching a junction. The particular quality of silence that means a large chamber is ahead. The marks on the wall that in combination tell you something specific and important about where you are and what lies ahead. This is what the navigational marking system was for. Not just to convey information in the abstract, to anchor the underground intelligence of the passage users to specific locations within the network. To say, in the most compact possible form, this is where you are, this is what you need to know from here. The marks were an interface between the network's built-in information and the user's internalized underground intelligence. Together they would have made navigation through a continental underground system not just possible but reliable and efficient. Think about what reliable underground navigation means for the kind of civilization we are describing. It means you can send a person into the underground at one point on the continent with a specific task and have confidence they will arrive at their destination, accomplish their task, and return. It means you can move goods through the network with enough confidence in the route to justify the investment. It means you can maintain the kind of regular, reliable communication between distant nodes that a complex civilization requires in order to function as a coherent entity rather than a collection of isolated communities. This is logistics, not exotic technology, not supernatural capability, logistics. The same thing that made the Roman road network function. The same thing that made the Inca road system work. The management of movement and communication and supply through a built infrastructure. The difference is that the infrastructure in question was underground rather than on the surface, which means it was invisible to later observers who were only looking at the surface. The Roman roads are famous. They are still there, or their traces are still there, and they have been studied for centuries. The Inca roads are famous. The trail system of the Inca Empire is one of the most studied road networks in pre-Columbian archaeology. But the American tunnel network, which may have functioned as the logistical infrastructure of a civilization that predates both Rome and the Inca by thousands of years, is not famous, is not studied by the mainstream, is not acknowledged in the textbooks, because you cannot see it from the surface, because it was built where the weather cannot reach and where the casual observer cannot look, because it requires a specific kind of investigation, underground investigation, to find it. And because the people whose professional obligation it is to do that investigation have, for reasons that reflect the sociology of academic institutions, more than the logic of evidence, consistently declined to pursue it. But the evidence does not care about the sociology of academic institutions. The evidence exists in the rock, accumulating no debt of acknowledgement, requiring no institutional validation to remain real. And the people who have gone underground and found it, who have photographed it and measured it and dated it and cross-referenced it against every other body of evidence available to them, have done enough that the case is no longer dependent on any single researcher or any single discovery. The case is distributed across cave systems in 4 states, across indigenous traditions in dozens of communities, across geological dating analyses conducted by multiple independent researchers in multiple locations, across ground-penetrating radar datasets, speleothem chemistry records, bat movement tracking data, rock art analysis, isotope analysis of human remains, anomalous cartographic evidence, and the accumulated weight of oral traditions that have been carrying the geographic specificity of this underground network for 800 years of dormancy. The case is real, it is documented, It is waiting for the moment when enough of the right people are paying attention to make the denial no longer viable. That moment is not yet here, but it is closer than it has ever been. And the tunnels, patient in the dark, holding everything they were built to hold, are ready for whenever it arrives. The stone endures, the marks remain. The passages are still open to whoever comes looking with the right combination of knowledge and humility and willingness to be astonished by what the earth has kept for us in the places we have not yet thought to look. Down is the direction, the underground is the archive, and the history of this continent is deeper than anything the surface has been able to tell us. Go deep enough, and everything changes. Go deep enough, and the story that has been missing from every textbook, from every classroom, from every official account of what this land was before the Europeans named it, is right there on the walls, in the rock, in the specific texture of deliberately smooth surfaces and the specific geometry of marks placed at junctions by hands that knew exactly what they were doing and why. The hands are gone, the marks remain, and the story the marks tell is the one that this land has been trying to tell us all along. The story of what was here before the history books begin. The story of the civilization whose infrastructure we are standing on and living above and walking over every day without knowing it. That story is still being told, quietly, in the dark, in the language of stone, by passages that breathe and walls that carry marks and chambers where somebody once stood exactly where a researcher now stands, centuries apart, both of them in the same dark, both of them reaching for the same truth that the rock holds between them like a gift that neither of them can fully unwrap alone. The researchers in the informal network have a phrase they use among themselves when someone brings new evidence to the group. They say, "The rock doesn't argue." It is a shorthand for something that has become central to the methodology of this work over the years. Unlike written records, which can be forged, altered, misinterpreted, or selectively presented, unlike oral accounts, which can be contaminated by expectation or shaped by the frameworks through which they are transmitted, unlike institutional claims, which are always embedded in the interests of the institutions making them, physical evidence in rock simply is what it is. The uranium-thorium ratio in a formation is not negotiating with you. The tool marks on a passage wall are not trying to persuade you of anything. The consistent passage cross-section, the leveled floor, the navigation marks at the junction, these things exist independent of anyone's desire for them to exist or not exist. They are not making an argument. They are presenting themselves, to whoever looks, with a directness that no human communication can match. This is why the cave systems are where the most important evidence in this investigation lives. Not in documents, not in institutional records, not in the testimonies of researchers or the traditions of communities, valuable as those are, in rock. In the specific, unambiguous, time-stamped physical record that the geology of the cave systems has been maintaining without anyone's permission for as long as the passages have existed. The geology is the most reliable witness in this case, and the geology is saying things that the standard model of North American prehistory cannot accommodate. This is not a comfortable situation for the standard model. Models do not like being told they cannot accommodate what the evidence is saying. The natural response of a model under pressure from inconvenient evidence is to question the evidence rather than the model, to demand higher standards of proof for the inconvenient finding than for the convenient one, to find procedural objections to the methodology, to note that the finding has not been replicated in peer-reviewed literature, while declining to engage with the reasons why it has not been submitted to peer-reviewed literature or why, on the occasions when it has not been published. These responses are understandable. They are also, ultimately, insufficient, because the evidence accumulates regardless of the model's comfort. Because the rock does not argue, and it does not care whether the model is comfortable, and it will continue presenting its evidence to whoever goes underground and looks with the patience of something that has been in place for much longer than any academic model. The moment of reckoning is not yet here, but the evidence is building toward it with the same steady accumulation that speleothem formations build, layer by layer, sample by sample, cave by cave, passage by passage, junction by junction. The picture is becoming too detailed and too consistent to be held at the margins indefinitely. In the Appalachian caves, a researcher spent 3 days in a system in eastern Tennessee documenting a section of passage that showed the now familiar profile. Smooth walls, leveled floor, navigation marks at the point where the passage divided. She brought better light than previous researchers had used in that system, and the better light revealed something that earlier documentation had missed. On the wall above the navigation marks, at a height that would put it above the sightline of most adults walking through the passage, there was another set of marks. Different from the navigational marks in character, smaller and more densely arranged, they were visible only when the light was angled specifically to bring out the surface relief. She documented them, photographed them from every angle, made rubbings of the surface, and when she brought the documentation back to the informal network, and the group began to compare it with documentation from other locations, they found correspondences. Specific elements in the upper wall marks that appeared in similar positions relative to the navigational marks in documentation from Arizona and from Illinois, not identical, but recognizably related. The same general organizational principle applied consistently across locations that are hundreds of miles apart. This kind of correspondence is what the case for a unified, continent-spanning notation system rests on, not the claim that every mark in every location is identical, but that the marks share structural and organizational principles that are too consistent across too many locations to reflect independent development, that whoever was making the marks in Tennessee, and whoever was making the marks in Arizona, and whoever was making the marks in Illinois, was working within the same system, drawing on the same conventions, encoding information in ways that a user of the system would recognize and be able to read regardless of which passage they found themselves in. This is what a writing system does. Or more precisely, this is what a navigational notation system does when it has been standardized across a large geographic area by a civilization with sufficient organizational coherence to maintain standards. It produces recognizable family resemblances that persist across regional variations. Consistent structural principles that allow users to extract meaning even when the specific marks they encounter are not identical to ones they have seen before. The American Tunnel Network has this. The notation system has been identified in enough locations by enough independent researchers using consistent documentation methods to establish that it is real and that it is systematic. What has not yet been established, because the work of decipherment has barely begun, is what it means. What specific information each element encodes. What a user of the system would have known when they stood at a junction and read the marks and made their decision about which passage to take. That decipherment is the next stage of the investigation. And it is, by all accounts of those who have been thinking about it, going to require a genuinely interdisciplinary approach. Linguists with experience in undeciphered scripts, mathematicians who specialize in cryptography and code structure, indigenous knowledge holders who may have retained elements of the traditional understanding of what the marks mean, geographers who can model the spatial relationships that the marks appear to be encoding, and researchers with the underground experience to understand the physical context in which the marks were placed and read. This is not a small undertaking, but it is an undertaking that is now possible in ways it was not even a decade ago. The analytical tools are available, the documentation is sufficient to work with, the collaborative relationships between researchers and indigenous communities are developed enough to begin the more detailed conversations that decipherment would require, and the informal network has, over the years, quietly assembled exactly the kind of interdisciplinary group that the work requires. When the decipherment begins in earnest, this story will enter a new phase, not the phase of accumulating evidence that something is there, the phase of understanding what it says, and what the tunnel network's notation system says about its builders, about the civilization they represented, about the information they needed to encode and the users they encoded it for, is going to be the most revealing chapter yet in a story that has already revealed more about ancient North America than anything produced by mainstream archaeology in the past century. The stone is not finished speaking, it has barely begun. There are children growing up right now in communities near documented tunnel network locations who will, if the trajectory of this investigation continues, grow up to be the first generation of researchers who approach this subject with the full weight of the accumulated evidence behind them, who will enter the field knowing that the tunnels are there, knowing that the notation system exists, knowing that the geological dating places certain sections of the system outside the comfortable boundaries of conventional prehistory, who will not have to fight the same battles that the current generation of researchers has spent careers fighting, who will be able to build directly on the foundation, rather than spending their energy establishing that there is a foundation to build on. This is how knowledge advances, not in sudden revolutions, though revolutions do happen, in the slow accumulation of evidence that changes the starting conditions for the next generation. The researchers who are doing this work now are not doing it for themselves. They are doing it for those children, for the generation that will arrive at the investigation with better tools, better datasets, better collaborative relationships, and the enormous advantage of not having to prove that the subject is worth investigating. The tunnels will still be there for those children, unchanged by the passage of time, still bearing the marks that were placed in them, still connecting the nodes of a network that once served a civilization we are only beginning to understand, still breathing with the slow rhythm of pressure equalization that the Lakota have been listening to for as long as their tradition reaches, still waiting for whoever comes next to find what the previous generation found and to understand it more fully and to pass it to the generation after them in clearer, more complete, more rigorously documented form. This is the work, not glamorous, not immediate, not rewarded with the kind of recognition that motivates people who are primarily interested in recognition, but necessary and deeply meaningful in the way that necessary work always is to the people who understand what it is for. The evidence exists, the network is real, the civilization that built it was real, and the truth of its existence, embedded in stone that does not argue and does not lie and does not forget, will reach the surface when enough people have done enough of the work that needs to be done. Until then, the tunnels breathe, the formations grow, infinitely slowly, over the marked walls. The passages hold their consistent cross-sections through the slow geological processes that will, given enough more time, eventually change them beyond recognition, but enough time has not yet passed. The rock is still readable, the marks are still clear, the levels of the floors are still smooth under the boots of whoever goes down to look. Go down and look. That is the invitation. That is what the marks on the walls have always been saying. Go down, look carefully. We made this for you to find. We left everything you need to understand it. The work of understanding is yours, but the evidence is ours. And we left it in the most protected place we knew. The ground is full of gifts. This country, this continent, this landscape that stretches from the Gulf Coast to the Canadian border and from the Atlantic cliff faces to the Pacific shore, sits above an underground that is richer and stranger and older and more carefully made than anything the surface suggests. The surface is the facade, the underground is the foundation, and the foundation tells a story that the facade has been concealing, not out of malice, simply out of the blindness that comes from never looking in the right direction. Look down. The direction has always been down, and the truth, patient and physical and indifferent to how long it takes us to find it, is there in the rock, exactly where it was left, waiting for the moment when enough of the right people finally go looking. That moment is always closer than it seems, and the tunnels will be there when it arrives, exactly as they have always been, holding what they were given to hold, in the patient dark of the American underground, where the history that the textbooks missed has been keeping itself safe for longer than anyone has yet been willing to admit. In the years since the informal research network began to coalesce around this evidence, the technology available to investigate it has changed significantly. When the first researchers were squeezing through narrow passages in Texas cave systems with film cameras and hand-drawn maps, the idea of using ground-penetrating radar to characterize subsurface features from the surface was still largely in the domain of military and industrial applications. LiDAR was not yet available as a research tool. DNA analysis was not yet capable of the population-level geographic precision it now offers. The computational tools for cross-referencing large datasets across multiple evidence types did not exist in accessible form. All of that has changed, and the change has accelerated the investigation in ways that were not predictable even 15 years ago. What took a researcher months of underground work to document in the 1990s can now be characterized in preliminary form from the surface in days using remote sensing technology. The geographic reach of the investigation has expanded accordingly. Systems that would previously have required years of systematic cave exploration to characterize are now showing their basic structure in radar surveys. The network is becoming visible from above in ways it could previously only be seen from within. This does not replace the underground work. The surface surveys identify targets and characterize connectivity and structure, but the details, the marks, the surfaces, the features that confirm intentional modification, those require someone to go in and look. The technology and the fieldwork are complementary, and the combination of the two is producing a picture of the tunnel network's extent and organization that neither alone could provide. The picture is larger than anyone expected. The informal network's estimates of the system's extent have grown with every addition to the dataset. What began as a hypothesis about specific cave systems in Texas has expanded to a documented pattern spanning multiple states and potentially multiple regions of the continent. The consistency of the pattern across that geographic range is the most powerful argument for its reality. Random geological variation does not produce consistent navigational notation systems and consistent passage profiles and consistent connection patterns across thousands of miles. Only intention produces that kind of consistency. The intention is there in the rock, the pattern is there in the data, the story is there in the traditions of the communities whose ancestors built and used and finally sealed the passages. And the truth is moving, slowly, and with the pace that careful, rigorous, underfunded, independent research always moves at, toward the moment when it can no longer be contained by the institutions that have, for reasons that are understandable, if not defensible, chosen not to look. The underground is the archive. The stone is the evidence. The direction has always been down. And the history of this continent, older and deeper and stranger than anything the surface has been able to tell, is waiting there for us in the passages that something made, and the walls that something marked, and the dark that has been keeping everything safe until the right people finally come looking. They are coming. The evidence is ready. And the tunnels, as they have always been, are patient. What makes a discovery real in the scientific sense is not the moment someone finds something. It is the moment the finding becomes verifiable to others who didn't make it. The process of moving from finding to verifiable discovery is the work that the informal network has been engaged in for decades, documenting in ways that allow replication, cross-referencing against independent evidence bases, building the methodological foundation that allows someone who was not present for the original observation to evaluate it on its merits. This process is slower than it needs to be because it is being conducted without institutional support by people working in their own time with their own resources. But slowness is not failure. The building of a genuinely rigorous evidentiary case for something as significant as this is inherently a long process. The standards are appropriately high. The work of meeting them is appropriately demanding. And the people doing it are, by all accounts, doing it well. The tunnels will not be verified in a single announcement. There will not be a press conference at which a scientist holds up a photograph and says, "Here it is, we found it, the question is settled." That is not how discoveries of this complexity and this significance work. What will happen, what is already beginning to happen, is a gradual accumulation of documented evidence that reaches the threshold of mainstream scientific attention at multiple points simultaneously. A ground-penetrating radar survey here, a formal geological analysis there, an indigenous knowledge collaboration that produces publishable findings in a venue that cannot be dismissed, a LiDAR survey result that requires explanation, a speleothem dating result that passes peer review. Each of these, in isolation, can be handled by the institutional machinery of non-engagement. Together, they cannot. The tipping point is not a single finding. It is a density of independent findings, each meeting the standards of the venues in which they appear, that collectively constitute an argument that the field can no longer manage around. That moment is coming. The people building toward it know it is coming, and they are building as carefully and as quickly as the resources available to them allow. The stone will still be there. The marks will still be there. The passages will still be there. When the mainstream finally goes to look, it will find exactly what the informal network has been documenting for 30 years. And the conversation that follows will be one of the most significant conversations in the history of American science. That conversation has not yet begun in earnest, but the ground is being prepared for it, underground and above, in the documentation that accumulates, and the relationships that deepen, and the evidence that refuses to stop presenting itself to whoever is willing to go looking. The tunnels breathe. The evidence is real. The direction is down. And the truth is as patient as the stone that holds it. The search continues. It has always continued, even in the years when the evidence was being ignored or suppressed, or simply overlooked by the institutions with the resources to pursue it. The searches continues in the caves, and in the radar surveys, and in the conversations between researchers and elders, and in the careful, patient work of building the case that the truth deserves. And the tunnels, dark and still and patient, hold everything they were made to hold in the deep rock of the American continent, waiting for the world to finally be ready to receive what the ground has been keeping for it all along. The direction is down. The evidence is real, the story is not finished, and the stone, as it has always been, endures. What is buried beneath America is not a secret that can be kept indefinitely. The rock is too honest. The evidence is too physical. The traditions that have carried the memory of these passages are too specific and too accurate in their geography to be dismissed as myth. The tunnels were built by minds like ours, for purposes that served a civilization we have not yet learned to see, in the most permanent material available to them, in the most protected place available to them. And they left marks on the walls so that whoever came next would know which way to go. We are whoever came next. The marks are there. We are learning to read them. And the direction they point, as it has always been in this story, is down into the patient, truthful, ancient dark, where the real history of this continent has been waiting, with all the patience of stone, for the moment when we are finally ready to look. The morning will come when this is understood, when the institutions catch up to the evidence, when the standard model is revised to include what the ground has been showing us all along, when the indigenous traditions that have preserved this knowledge across centuries of suppression are finally recognized as the historical records they have always been. That morning has not yet arrived, but it is coming. The underground knows it, the stone knows it, and the tunnels, patient in the dark, holding the marks and the levels and the connections that something made and left for us to find, are ready. Always ready. It has always been.